The Nutcracker by Alexander Dumas. Preface, which shows how the author was forced to relate the history of the Nutcracker of Nuremberg. There was a juvenile party at the house of my friend Lord M., and I had helped to add to the number and noise of the company by taking my little daughter. It is true that in half an hour during which I joined in 4 or 5 games of blind man's buff, hot cockles, and hunt the slipper, in spite of the noise which was made by a couple of dozen delightful little rogues from 8 to 10 years old, and who seemed to try which would talk the loudest, I slipped out of the drawing-room and sought a certain snug parlor which I knew, and where I hoped to enjoy a little peace for an hour or so. I had effected my retreat with as much skill as success, escaping not only without being perceived by the juvenile guests, which was not very difficult, considering how intent they were upon their games, but also unnoticed by their parents, which was not so easy a matter. I had reached the wished-for parlor when I observed, on entering it, that it was for the moment converted into a supper-room, the sideboards being heaped up with confectionery and other refreshments. Now, as these appearances seemed to promise that I should not be disturbed until supper time, I threw myself into a comfortable armchair, quite delighted with the idea that I was about to enjoy an hour's peace after the dreadful noise which had deafened me in the drawing-room. I don't know exactly how it was, but at the end of about 10 minutes I fell fast asleep. I cannot say how long I had thus lost all knowledge of what was passing around, when I was suddenly aroused by loud peals of laughter. I opened my eyes in terror and saw nothing but the beautifully painted ceiling over my head. And then I tried to get up, but the attempt was useless, for I was fastened to my chair as firmly as Gulliver was on the shore of Lilliput. I immediately understood in what a scrape I had got myself. I had been surprised in the enemy's country and was a prisoner of war. The best thing for me to do in such a case was to put a good face upon the matter and entreat for my liberty. My first proposal was to take my conquerors the very next morning to Fairies and treat them to anything they liked, but, unhappily, the moment was not well chosen for such an offer. I was addressing myself to an audience already well stuffed with tarts, and whose hands were filled with patties. My proposal was therefore refused in plain terms. I then offered to take the entire party to Vauxhall next evening and amuse them with the exhibition of fireworks. The proposal was well received by the little boys, but the little girls would not listen to it because they were dreadfully afraid of fireworks. They could not endure the noise of the crackers, and the smell of the gunpowder annoyed them. I was about to make a third offer when I heard a sweet little musical voice whispering in the ears of a companion certain words which made me tremble. "Ask Papa, who writes novels, to tell us some pretty story." I was on the point of protesting against this, but my voice was drowned by cries of, "Oh, yes, a story! We will have a story!" "But, my dear children," I said as loud as I could, "you ask me the most difficult thing in the world. A story indeed! Ask me to recite one of Gay's fables or My Name is Norval, if you will, and I may consent, but a story?" "We don't want anything out of the speaker," cried the children all together. "We want a story." "My dear little friends, if—" "There is no if in the cause. We will have a story." "But, my dear little friends, I say again—" "There is no but. We will have a story." "Yes, we will have a story. We will have a story," now echoed on all sides, and in a manner which was too positive to object to any longer. "Well," I said with a sigh, "if you must, you must." "Ah, that's capital!" cried my little tormentors. "But I must tell you one thing," said I. "The story I am about to relate is not my own." "Never mind that, so long as it amuses us." I must confess that I was a little vexed to think that my audience set so light a value upon my own writings. "Whose tale is it then, sir?" asked a pretty voice, belonging no doubt to some little being more curious than the others. It is by Hoffman, miss. Have you ever heard of Hoffman?" "No, sir, I've never heard of him." "And what is the name of your story, sir?" asked a young gentleman who, being the son of the nobleman that gave the party, felt a right to question me. "The History of a Nutcracker," was my answer. "Does the title please you, my dear Henry?" "Humph! I don't think the title promises anything particularly fine. But never mind, go on. If it does not please us, we will stop you, and you must begin another. And so on, I can tell you, until you really do fix upon a good one." "One moment," I exclaimed. "I will not accept those conditions. If you were grown-up persons, well and good." "Nevertheless, those are our conditions. If not, a prisoner, you must remain with us forever." "My dear Henry, you're a charming boy, well brought up, and I shall be much surprised if you do not some day become Prime Minister of England. Let me go free, and I will do all you ask." "On your word of honor?" "On my word of honor." At the same moment I felt the 1,000 threads that held me suddenly become loose. Each of the little tormentors had set to work to untie a knot, and in half a minute I was at liberty. Now, as everyone must keep his word, even when it is pledged to children, I desired my audience to sit round me, and when the children had all placed themselves in a manner so comfortable that I fancied they would soon fall off to sleep in the chairs, I began my story in the following manner. Godfather Drosselmeyer. Once upon a time there lived at Nuremberg, in Germany, a judge of great respectability, and who was called Judge Silberhaus, which means Silver House. This judge had a son and daughter. The son was 9 years old and was named Fritz. The daughter, who was 7½ was called Mary. There were 2 beautiful children, but so different in disposition and features that no one would have believed them to be brother and sister. Fritz was a fine, stout boy with ruddy cheeks and roguish looks. He was very impatient and stamped on the floor whenever he was contradicted, for he thought that everything in the world had been made for his amusement, or to suit his fancy. In this humor he would remain until the judge, annoyed by his cries and screams, or by his stamping, came out of his study and raising his finger said with a frown, "Master Fritz." These 2 words were quite sufficient to make Master Fritz wish that the earth would open and swallow him up. As for his mother, it was no matter how much or how often she raised her forefinger, for Fritz did not mind her at all. His sister Mary was, on the contrary, a delicate and pale child, with long hair, curling naturally and flowing over her little white shoulders like a flood of golden light upon a vase of alabaster. She was sweet, amiable, bashful, and kind to all who were in sorrow, even to her dolls. She was very obedient to her mamma, and never contradicted her governess, Miss Trudchen, so that Mary was beloved by everyone. Now, the 24th of December, 1700 and such, had arrived. You all know, my dear young friends, that the 24th of December is called Christmas Eve, being the day before the one on which the Redeemer Jesus was born. But I must now explain something to you. You have all heard, perhaps, that every country has its peculiar customs, and the best read amongst you are aware that Nuremberg in Germany is a town famous for its toys, puppets, and playthings, of which it exports great quantities to other countries. You will admit, therefore, that the little boys and girls of Nuremberg ought to be the happiest children in the world, unless, indeed, they are like the inhabitants of Ostend, who seem only to delight in their oysters for the purpose of sending them to foreign markets. Germany, being quite a different country from England, has altogether other customs. In England, New Year's Day is the grand day for making presents, so that many parents would be very glad if the year always commenced with the 2nd of January. But in Germany, the great day for presents is the 24th of December, the one preceding Christmas Day. Moreover, in Germany, children's presents are given in a peculiar way. A large shrub is placed upon a table in the drawing room, and to all its branches are hung the toys to be distributed among the children. Such playthings as are too heavy to hang to the shrub are placed on the table, and the children are then told that it is their guardian angel who sends them all those pretty toys. This is a very innocent deception after all, and perhaps it can scarcely be called a deception because all the good things of this world are sent to us by heaven. I need scarcely tell you that among those children of Nuremberg who received most presents were the son and daughter of Judge Silberhaus. For besides their father and mother, who doted on them, they also had a godfather who loved them dearly, and whose name was Drosselmeyer. I must describe in a few words the portrait of this illustrious person who occupied in the town of Nuremberg a position almost as high as that of Judge Silberhaus himself. Godfather Drosselmeyer, who was a great physician and doctor of medicine, was by no means a very good-looking person. He was a tall, thin man about 6 feet high, but who stooped very much so that in spite of the length of his legs, he could almost pick up his handkerchief, if it fell, without stooping any lower. His face was wrinkled as a golden rennet that was withered and fallen from the tree. Being blind of the right eye, he wore a black patch, and being entirely bald, he wore a shining and frizzled wig, which he had made himself with spun glass, such as you may have seen the glass-blowers spin at the Adelaide Gallery or Polytechnic Institute. He was, however, compelled, for fear of damaging this ingenious contrivance, to carry his hat under his arm. His remaining eye was sparkling and bright, and seemed not only to perform its own duty, but that of its absent companion, so rapidly did it glance round any room, which Godfather Drosselmeyer was desirous to scrutinize in all points, or fix upon any person whose secret thoughts he wished to read. Now, Godfather Drosselmeyer, who was a learned doctor, did not follow the example of those physicians who allow their patients to die, but occupied his time in giving life to dead things. I mean that by studying the formation of men and animals, he had gained so deep a knowledge of the manner in which they are made that he was able to manufacture men who could walk, bow to each other, and go through their exercises with a musket. He also made ladies who danced and played upon their harpsichord, the harp and the viol, dogs that ran, carried, and barked, birds that flew, hopped, and sang, and fish that swam and ate crumbs of bread. He had even succeeded in making puppets and images of Punch utter a few words, not many, it is true, but such as Papa, Mama, etc. The tones were certainly harsh and always the same in sound, because you can very well understand that all this was done merely by means of machinery concealed inside the toys, and no machinery can ever perform the same wonders as the beings which God had created. Nevertheless, in spite of all difficulties, Godfather Drosselmeyer did not despair of being some day able to make real men, real women, real dogs, real birds, and real fish. It is scarcely necessary to add that his 2 godchildren, to whom he had promised the first proofs of his success in this line, awaited the happy moment with great impatience. Godfather Drosselmeyer, having reached this state of perfection in mechanical science, was a most useful man to his friends. Thus, for instance, if a timepiece at the house of Judge Silberhaus got out of order, in spite of the attentions of the usual clockmakers, if the hands had suddenly stopped, if the tick-tick seemed to go badly, or if the wheels inside would not move, Godfather Drosselmeyer was immediately sent for, and he hastened to the house as quick as he could, for he was a man devoted to the art of mechanics. He was no sooner shown the poor clock than he instantly opened it, took out the works, and placed them between his knees. Then, with his eye glittering like a carbuncle, and his wig laid upon the floor, he drew from his pocket a number of little tools which he had made himself, and the proper use of which he alone knew. Choosing the most pointed one, he plunged it into the very midst of the works, to the great alarm of little Mary, who could not believe that the poor clock did not suffer from the operation. But in a short time, when the old gentleman had touched the works in various parts, and then placed them again in their case, or on their stand, or between the 4 pillars of the timepiece, as the case might be, the clock soon began to revive, to tick as loud as ever, and to strike with its shrill, clear voice at the proper time, a circumstance that gave new life, as it were, to the room itself, which without it seemed a melancholy place. Moreover, in compliance with the wishes of little Mary, who was grieved to see the kitchen dog turning the spit, Godfather Drosselmeyer made a wooden dog, which by means of mechanism connected inside, turned the spit without annoyance to itself. Turk, who had done this duty for 3 years until he had become quite shaky all over, was now able to lie down in peace in front of the kitchen fire and amuse himself by watching the movement of his successor. Thus, after the judge, after the judge's wife, after Fritz, and after Mary, the dog Turk was certainly the next inmate of the house who had most reason to love and respect Godfather Drosselmeyer. Turk was indeed grateful, and showed his joy whenever Drosselmeyer drew near the house, by leaping up against the front door and wagging his tail even before the old gentleman had knocked. On the evening of the 24th of December, just as the twilight was approaching, Fritz and Mary, who had not been allowed to enter the drawing-room all day, were huddled together in a corner of the dining-parlor. Miss Trudchen, the governess, was knitting near the window, to which she had moved her chair in order to catch the last rays of daylight. The children were seized with a kind of vague fear because the candles had not been brought into the room, according to custom, so they were talking in a low tone to each other, just as children talk when they are afraid. "Fritz," said Mary, "I am sure Papa and Mamma are busy in preparing the Christmas tree, for ever since the morning I have heard a great deal going on in the drawing-room, which we were forbidden to enter." "And I know," said Fritz, "by the way Turk barked 10 minutes ago, that Godfather Drosselmeyer has arrived." "Oh, I wonder what our dear godfather has brought us!" exclaimed Mary, clapping her little hands. "I am sure it will be a beautiful garden planted with trees, and with a beautiful river running between the banks, covered with flowers. And on the river, too, there will be some silver swans with collars of gold, and a little girl will bring them sweet cake, which they will eat out of her apron." "In the first place, miss," said Fritz, in that authoritative tone which was natural to him, and which his parents considered to be one of his greatest faults, "you must know that swans do not eat sweet cake." "I thought they did," answered Mary, "but as you are a year and a half older than I, you must know best." Fritz tossed his head up with an air of importance. "And for my part," he continued, "I feel certain that if Godfather Drosselmeyer brings anything at all, it will be a castle with soldiers to watch it, and enemies to attack it. We shall then have some famous battles." "I do not like battles," said Mary. "If he does bring a castle, as you think he will, it must be for you. I shall, however, take care of the wounded." "Whatever it is that he brings," returned Fritz, "you know very well that is neither for you nor for me, because the toys which Godfather Drosselmeyer gives us are always taken away again immediately afterwards, under pretense that they really are works of great art. Then you know they are always put into that great cupboard with the glass doors, and on the top shelves which Papa himself can only reach when he stands upon a chair. So, after all, I much prefer the toys which Papa and Mamma give us, and which we are allowed to play with until we break them into 1,000 pieces." "And so do I," answered Mary. "Only we must not say so to Godfather." "And why not?" "Because he would feel annoyed to think that we do not like his toys as much as those which Papa and Mamma gives us. He gives them to us, thinking to please us, and it would be wrong to tell him the contrary." "Oh, nonsense!" cried Fritz. "Miss Mary is quite right, Master Fritz," said Dame Trudchen. who was generally very silent and only spoke on important occasions. "Come," said Mary hastily, in order to prevent Fritz from giving an impudent answer to the poor governess. "Let us guess what our parents intend to give us. For my part, I told Mamma, but upon condition that she should not scold, that Miss Rose, my doll, grows more and more awkward, in spite of the lessons which I am constantly giving her, and that she does nothing but fall upon her nose, which never fails to leave most disagreeable marks upon her face, so that I can no longer take her into decent society, because her face does not all correspond with her frocks." "And I," said Fritz, "did not hesitate to assure Papa that a nice little horse would look admirably well in my stables. I also took the opportunity to inform him that no army can possibly exist without cavalry, and that I want a squadron of hussars to complete the division which I command." These words made Miss Trudchen conclude that the moment was favorable for her to speak a second time. "Master Fritz and Miss Mary," said she, "you know very well that it is your guardian angel who sends and blesses all those fine toys which are given to you. Do not therefore say beforehand what you want, because the angel knows much better than you what will please you." "Oh," cried Fritz, "and yet last year he sent me foot soldiers, although I have just said I should have been better satisfied with a squadron of hussars." "For my part, I have only to thank my good angel," said Mary, "for I did but ask for a doll last year, and I not only had the doll, but also a beautiful white dove with red feet and beak." In the meantime the night had altogether drawn in, and the children, who by degrees spoke lower and lower and grew closer and closer together, fancied that they heard the wings of their guardian angels fluttering near them, and a sweet music in the distance, like that of an organ accompanying the hymn of the Nativity, beneath the gloomy arches of a cathedral. Presently a sudden light shone upon the wall for a moment, and Fritz and Mary believed that it was their guardian angel, who, after depositing the toys in the drawing-room, flew away in the midst of a golden lustre to visit other children, who were expecting him with the same impatience as themselves. Immediately afterward a bell rang. The door was thrown violently open, and so strong a light burst into the apartment that the children were dazzled, and uttered cries of surprise and alarm. The judge and his wife then appeared at the door, and took the hands of their children, saying, "Come, little dears, and see what the guardian angels have sent you." The children hastened to the drawing-room, and Miss Trudchen, having placed her work upon a chair, followed them. The Christmas Tree. My dear children, you all know the beautiful stalls in the Soho Bazaar, the Pantheon, and the Lowther Arcade, and your parents have often taken you there to permit you to choose whatever you liked best. Then you have stopped short with longing eyes and an open mouth, and you have experienced a pleasure which you will never again know in your lives, no, not even when you become men and acquire titles and fortunes. Well, the same joy was felt by Fritz and Mary when they entered the drawing-room and saw the great tree growing, as it were, from the middle of the table, and covered with blossoms made of sugar, and sugar plums instead of fruit, the whole glittering by the light of 100 Christmas candles concealed amidst the leaves. At the beautiful sight Fritz leapt for joy and danced about in a manner which showed how well he had attended to the lessons of his dancing master. On her side, Mary could not restrain 2 large tears of joy, which like liquid pearls rolled down her countenance that was open and smiling as a rose in June. But the children's joy knew no bounds when they came to examine all the pretty things which covered the table. There was a beautiful doll, twice as large as Miss Rose, and there was also a charming silk frock hung on a stand in such a manner that Mary could walk around it. Fritz was also well pleased, for he found upon the table a squadron of hussars with red jackets and gold lace, and mounted on white horses while on the carpet near the table, stood the famous horse which he also much longed to see in his stables. In a moment did this modern Alexander leap upon the back of that brilliant Bucephalus, which was already saddled and bridled, and having ridden 2 or 3 times around the table, he got off again, declaring that though the animal was very spirited and restive, he should soon be able to tame him in such a manner that ere a month passed the horse would be quiet as a lamb. But at the moment when Fritz set his foot upon the ground, and when Mary was baptizing her new doll by the name of Clara, the bell rang a second time, and the children turned towards that corner of the room when the sound came. Then they beheld something which had hitherto escaped their attention, so intent had they been upon the beautiful Christmas tree. In fact, the corner of the room of which I had just spoken was concealed, or cut off, as it were, by a large Chinese screen, behind which there was a certain noise accompanied by a certain sweet music, which proved that something unusual was going on in that quarter. The children then recollected that they had not yet seen the doctor, and they both exclaimed at the same moment, "Oh, Godpapa Drosselmeyer!" At these words, and as if it had only waited for that exclamation to put itself in motion, the screen opened inwards and showed not only Godfather Drosselmeyer, but something more. In the midst of a green meadow decorated with flowers stood a magnificent country seat, with numerous windows all made of real glass in front and 2 gilt towers on the wings. At the same moment the jingling bells was heard from within. The doors and windows opened, and the rooms inside were discovered lighted up by wax tapers half an inch high. In those rooms were several little gentlemen and ladies, all walking about, the gentlemen splendidly dressed in laced coats, in silk waistcoats and breeches, each with a sword by his side and a hat under his arm. The ladies gorgeously attired in brocades, their hair dressed in the style of the 18th century, and each one holding a fan in her hand, wherewith they all fanned themselves as if overcome by the heat. In the central drawing-room, which actually seemed to be on fire, so splendid was the luster of the crystal chandelier, filled with wax candles. A number of children were dancing to the jingling music, the boys all in round jackets and the girls all in short frocks. At the same time a gentleman clad in a furred cloak appeared at the window of an adjoining chamber, made signs, and then disappeared again, while Godfather Drosselmeyer himself, with his drab frock coat, the patch on his eye, and the glass wig, so like the original, although only 3 inches high, that the puppet might be taken for the doctor, as if seen at a great distance, went out and in the front door of the mansion with the air of a gentleman, inviting those who were walking outside to enter his abode. The first moment was one of surprise and delight for the 2 children, but, having watched the building for a few minutes with his elbows resting on the table, Fritz rose and exclaimed, "But Godpapa Drosselmeyer, why do you keep going out and coming in by the same door? You must be tired of going backward and forward like that. Come, enter by that door there, and come out by this one here." And Fritz pointed with his finger to the doors of the 2 towers. "No, that cannot be done," answered Godfather Drosselmeyer. "Well then," said Fritz, "do me the pleasure of going up those stairs and taking the place of that gentleman at the window. Then tell him to go down to the door." "It is impossible, my dear Fritz," again said the doctor. "At all events the children have danced enough. Let them go and walk, while the gentlemen and ladies who are now walking dance in their turn." "But you are not reasonable, you little rogue," cried the godpapa, who began to grow angry. "The mechanism must move in a certain way." "Then let me go into the house," said Fritz. "No, you are silly, my dear boy," observed the judge. "You see that it is impossible for you to enter the house, since the vanes on the top of the tower scarcely come up to your shoulders." Fritz yielded to this reasoning and held his tongue, but in a few moments, seeing that the ladies and gentlemen kept on walking, that the children would not leave off dancing, that the gentleman with the furred cloak appeared and disappeared at regular intervals, and that Godfather Drosselmeyer did not leave the door, he again broke his silence. "My dear godpapa," said he, "if all these little figures can do nothing more than what they are doing over and over again, you may take them away tomorrow, for I do not care about them, and I like my horse much better, because it runs when I choose, and my hussars because they maneuver at my command, and the wheel to the right or left or march forward or backward, and are not shut up in any house like your poor little people, who can only move over and over in the same way." With these words he turned his back upon Godfather Drosselmeyer and the house, hastened to the table, and drew up his hussars in battle array. As for Mary, she had slipped away very gently, because the motions of the little figures in the house seemed to her to be very tiresome. But as she was a charming child, she said nothing, for fear of wounding the feelings of Godpapa Drosselmeyer. Indeed, the moment Fritz turned his back, the doctor said to the judge and his wife in a tone of vexation, "This masterpiece is not fit for children, and I will put my house back again into the box and take it away." But the judge's wife approached him, and, in order to atone for her son's rudeness, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer to explain to her all the secrets of the beautiful house, and praised the ingenuity of the mechanism to such an extent that she not only made the doctor forget his vexations, but put him into such a good humor that he drew from the pockets of his drab coat a number of little men and women with horn complexions, white eyes, and gilt hands and feet. Besides the beauty of their appearance, these little men and women set forth a delicious perfume because they were made of cinnamon. At this moment Miss Trudchen called Mary and offered to help her put on the pretty little silk frock which she had so much admired on first entering the drawing-room. But Mary, in spite of her usual politeness, did not answer the governess, so much was she occupied with the new personage, whom she had discovered amongst the toys, and to whom, my dear children, I must briefly direct your attention, since he is actually the hero of my tale, in which Miss Trudchen, Mary, Fritz, the judge's lady, and even Godfather Drosselmeyer are only secondary characters. The Little Man with the Wooden Cloak. I told you that Mary did not reply to the invitation of Miss Trudchen, because she had just discovered a new toy which she had not before perceived. Indeed, by dint of making his hussars march and countermarch about the table, Fritz had brought to light a charming little gentleman, who, leaning in a melancholy mood against the trunk of the Christmas tree, awaited in silence and polite reserve the moment when his turn to be inspected should arrive. We must pause to notice the appearance of this little man, to whom I gave the epithet charming, somewhat hastily, for in addition to his body being too long and large for the miserable little thin legs which supported it, his head was of a size so enormous that it was quite at variance with the proportions indicated not only by nature, but also by those drawing masters who know much better than even nature herself. But if there were any fault in his person, that defect was atoned for by the excellence of his toilet, which denoted at once a man of education and taste. He wore a braided frock coat of violet-colored velvet, all frogged and covered with buttons, trousers of the same material, and the most charming little Wellington boots ever seen on the feet of a student or an officer. But these were two circumstances which seemed strange in respect to a man who preserved such elegant taste. The one was an ugly narrow cloak made of wood, and which hung down like a pig's tail from the nape of his neck to the middle of his back, and the other was a wretched cap, such as peasants sometimes wear in Switzerland upon his head. But Mary, When she perceived those two objects, which seemed so unsuitable to the rest of the costume, remembered that Godfather Drosselmeyer himself wore above his drab coat a little collar of no better appearance than the wooden cloak belonging to the little gentleman in the military frock, and that the doctor often covered his own bald head with an ugly and absolutely frightful cap, unlike all other ugly caps in the world. Although this circumstance did not prevent the doctor from being an excellent godpapa. She even thought to herself that were Godpapa Drosselmeyer to imitate altogether the dress of the little gentleman with the wooden cloak, he could not possibly become so genteel and interesting as the puppet. You can very well believe that these reflections on the part of Mary were not made without a close inspection of the little man, whom she liked from the very first moment that she saw him. Then the more she looked at him, the more she was struck by the sweetness and amiability which were expressed by his countenance. His clear green eyes, which were certainly rather goggle, beamed with serenity and kindness. The frizzled beard of white cotton, extending beneath his chin, seemed to become him amazingly because it set off the charming smile of his mouth, which rather wide perhaps, but then the lips were as red as vermilion. Thus was it that, after examining the little man for upwards of 10 minutes without daring to touch it, Mary exclaimed, "Oh, dear papa, who is that funny figure leaning against the Christmas tree?" "It belongs to no one in particular," answered the judge, "but to both of you together." "How do you mean, dear papa? I do not understand you." "This little man," continued the judge, "will help you both, for it is he who in future will crack all your nuts for you, and he belongs as much to Fritz as to you, and as much to you as Fritz." Thus speaking, the judge took up the little man very carefully, and raising his wood cloak, made him open his mouth by a very simple motion, and displayed 2 rows of sharp white teeth. Mary then placed the nut in the little man's mouth, and crack, crack, the shell was broken into a dozen pieces, and the kernel fell whole and sound into Mary's hand. The little girl then learnt that the dandified gentleman belonged to that ancient and respectable race of nutcrackers, whose origin is as ancient as that of the town of Nuremberg, and that he continued to exercise the honorable calling of his forefathers. Mary, delighted to have made this discovery, leapt for joy, whereupon the judge said, "Well, my dear little Mary, since the nutcracker pleases you so much, although it belongs equally to Fritz and yourself, it is to you that is specially trusted. I place it in your care." With these words, the judge handed the little fellow to Mary, who took the puppet in her arms and began to practice it in its vocation, choosing, however, so good was her heart, the smallest nuts, that it might not be compelled to open its mouth too wide, because by so doing its face assumed a most ridiculous expression. Then Miss Trudchen drew near to behold the little puppet in her turn, and for her also did it perform its duty in the most unassuming and obliging manner in the world, although she was but a dependent. While he was employed in training his horse and parading his hussars, Master Fritz heard the crack, crack, so often repeated that he felt sure something new was going on. He accordingly looked up and turned his large, inquiring eyes upon the group composed of the judge, Mary, and Miss Trudchen, and when he observed the little man with the wooden cloak and his sister's arms, he leapt from his horse, and without waiting to put the animal in its stable, hastened towards Mary. Then what a joyous shout of laughter burst from his lips as he espied the funny appearance of the little man opening his large mouth. Fritz also demanded his share of the nuts, which the puppet cracked, and this was of course granted. Next he wanted to hold the little man while he cracked the nuts, and this wish was also gratified. Only in spite of the remonstrances of his sister, Fritz chose the largest and hardest nuts to cram into his mouth, so that at the 5th or 6th crack, and out fell 3 of the poor little fellow's teeth. At the same time his chin fell and became tremulous like that of an old man. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker!" ejaculated Mary, snatching the little man from the hands of Fritz. "What a stupid fellow he is!" cried the boy. "He pretended to be a nutcracker, and his jaws are as brittle as glass. He is a false nutcracker, and he does not understand his duty. Give him to me, Mary. I will make him go on cracking my nuts, even if he loses all his teeth in doing so, and his chin is dislocated entirely. But how you seem to feel for the lazy fellow!" "No, no, no!" cried Mary, clasping the little man in her arms. "No! You shall not have my nutcracker. See how he looks at me, as much as to tell me that his poor jaw is hurt. Fie, Fritz! You are very ill-natured. You beat your horses, and the other day you shot one of your soldiers." "I beat my horses when they are restive," said Fritz, with an air of importance. "And as for the soldier, whom I shot the other day, he was a wretched scoundrel that I never have been able to do anything with for the last year, and who deserted one fine morning with his arms and baggage, a crime that is punishable by death in all countries. Besides, all these things are matters of discipline, which do not regard women. I do not prevent you from boxing your doll's ears, so don't try to hinder me from whipping my horses or shooting my soldiers. But I want the nutcracker." "Papa, Papa, help, help!" cried Mary, wrapping the little man in her pocket handkerchief. "Help! Fritz is going to take the nutcracker from me." At Mary's cries, not only the judge drew near the children, but his wife and godfather Drosselmeyer also ran towards them. The 2 children told their stories in their own way, Mary wishing to keep the nutcracker, and Fritz anxious to have it again. But to the astonishment of Mary, godfather Drosselmeyer, with a smile that seemed perfectly frightful to the poor little girl, decided in favor of Fritz. Happily for the poor nutcracker, the judge and his wife took little Mary's part. "My dear Fritz," said the judge, "I trusted the nutcracker to the care of your sister, and as far as my knowledge of surgery goes, I see that the poor creature is unwell and requires attention. I therefore give him over solely to the care of Mary until he is quite well, and no one must say a word against my decision. And you, Fritz, who stand up so firmly in behalf of military discipline, when did you ever hear of making a wounded soldier return to his duty? The wounded always go to the hospital until they are cured, and if they be disabled by their wounds, they are entitled to pensions." Fritz was about to reply, but the judge raised his forefinger to a level with his right eye and said, "Master Fritz, you have already seen what influence those 2 words had upon the little boy. Thus, ashamed at having drawn upon himself the rubberman conveyed in those words, he slipped quietly off without giving any answer to the table where his hussars were posted. Then, having placed their sentinels in their stations, he marched off the rest to their quarters for the night. In the meantime, Mary picked up the 3 little teeth which had fallen from the nutcracker's mouth, and kept the nutcracker himself well wrapped up in the pocket handkerchief she had also bound up his chin with a pretty white ribbon which she cut from the frock. On his side, the little man, who was at first very pale and much frightened, seemed quite contented in the care of his protectress, and gradually acquired confidence when he felt himself gently rocked in her arms. Then Mary perceived that godfather Drosselmeyer watched with mocking smiles the care which she bestowed upon the little man with the wooden cloak, and it struck her that the single eye of the doctor had acquired an expression of spite and malignity which she had never before seen. She therefore tried to get away from him, But Godfather Drosselmeyer burst out laughing, saying, "Well, my dear goddaughter, I am really astonished that a pretty girl like you can be so devoted to an ugly little urchin like that." Mary turned round, and much as she loved her godfather, even the compliment which he paid her did not make amends for the unjust attack he made upon the person of her Nutcracker. She even felt contrary to her usual disposition, very angry, and that vague comparison which she had before formed between the little man with the wooden cloak and her godfather returned to her memory. "Godpapa Drosselmeyer," she said, "you are unkind towards my little Nutcracker, whom you call an ugly urchin. Who knows whether you would even look so well as he, even if you had his pretty little military coat, his pretty little breeches, and his pretty little boots." At those words, Mary's parents burst out laughing, and the doctor's nose grew prodigiously longer. Why did the doctor's nose grow so much longer? Mary, surprised by the effect of her remark, could not guess the reason. But there are never any effects without causes. That reason no doubt belonged to some strange and unknown cause, which we must explain. Wonderful events. I do not know, my dear little friends, whether you remember that I spoke of a certain large cupboard with glass windows in which the children's toys were locked up. This cupboard was on the right side of the door of the judge's own room. Mary was still a baby in the cradle, and Fritz had only just begun to walk when the judge had that cupboard made by a very skillful carpenter, who put such brilliant glass in the frames that the toys appeared 1,000 times finer when ranged on the shelves than when they were held in the hand. Upon the top shelf of all, which neither Fritz nor Mary could reach, the beautiful pieces of workmanship of Godfather Drosselmeyer were placed. Immediately beneath was the shelf containing the picture books, and the 2 lower shelves were given to Fritz and Mary, who filled them in the way they liked best. It seemed, however, to have been tacitly agreed upon between the 2 children that Fritz should hold possession of the higher shelf of the 2, for the marshalling of his troops, and that Mary should keep the lower shelf for her dolls and their household. This arrangement was entered into on the eve of Christmas Day. Fritz placed his soldiers upon his own shelf, and Mary, having thrust Miss Rose into a corner, gave the bedroom, formed by the lowest shelf, to Miss Clara, with whom she invited herself to pass the evening and enjoy a supper of sugar plums. Miss Clara, on casting her eyes around, saw that everything was in proper order, her table well spread, and the sugar plums and conserved fruits, and her nice white bed with its white counterpane, all so neat and comfortable. She therefore felt very well satisfied with her new apartment. While all these arrangements were being made, the evening wore away. Midnight was approaching. Godfather Drosselmeyer had been gone a long time, and yet the children could not be persuaded to quit the cupboard. Contrary to custom, it was Fritz that yielded first to the persuasion of his parents, who told him that it was time to go to bed. "Well," said he, "after all the exercise which my poor hussars have had today, they must be fatigued, and as those excellent soldiers all know their duty towards me, and as so long as I remain here, they will not close their eyes. I must retire." With these words, and having given them the watchword to prevent them from being surprised by a patrol of the enemy, Fritz went off to bed. But this was not the case with Mary, and as her mamma, who was about to follow her husband to their bedchamber, desired her to tear herself away from the dearly beloved cupboard, little Mary said, "Only one moment, dear mamma, a single moment. Do let me finish all I have to do here. There are 100 or more important things to put to rights, and the moment I have settled them, I promise to go to bed." Mary requested this favor in so touching and plaintive a tone, she was moreover so glad and obedient a child, that her mother did not hesitate to grant her request. Nevertheless, as Miss Trudchen had already gone upstairs to Mary's bed ready, the judge's wife, thinking that her daughter might forget to put out the candles, performed that duty herself, leaving only a light in the lamp hanging from the ceiling. "Do not be long before you go to your room, dear little Mary," said the judge's wife, "for if you remain up too long, you will not be able to rise at your usual hour tomorrow morning." With these words, the lady quitted the room and closed the door behind her. The moment Mary found herself alone, she bethought herself above all things of her poor little Nutcracker, for she contrived to keep it in her arms, wrapped up in her pocket handkerchief. She placed him upon the table very gently, unrolled her handkerchief, and examined his chin. The Nutcracker still seemed to suffer much pain and appeared very cross. "Ah, my dear little fellow," she said in a low tone, "do not be angry, I pray, because my brother Fritz hurt you so much. He had no evil intention. Rest well assured, only his manners have become rough, and his heart is a little hardened by his soldier's life. Otherwise he is a very good boy, I can assure you, and I know that when you are better acquainted with him you will forgive him. Besides, to atone for the injury which he has done you, I will take care of you, which I will do so attentively that in a few days you will be quite well. As for putting the teeth again and fastening your chin properly, that is the business of Godpapa Drosselmeyer, who perfectly understands those kinds of things." Mary could say no more, for the moment she pronounced the name of Godfather Drosselmeyer, the Nutcracker to whom this discourse was addressed made so dreadful a grimace, and his eyes suddenly flashed so brightly, that the little girl stopped short in a fright, and stepped back a pace. But as the Nutcracker immediately afterwards resumed its amiable expression and its melancholy smile, she fancied that she must have been the sport of an illusion, and that the flame of the lamp, agitated by a current of air, had thus disfigured the little man. She even laughed at herself, saying, "I am indeed very foolish to think this wooden puppet could make faces to me. Come, let me draw near the poor fellow, and take that care of him which he requires." Having thus mused within herself, Mary took the puppet once more in her arms, drew near the cupboard, knocked at the glass door which Fritz had closed, and said to the new doll, "I beg of you, Miss Clara, to give up your bed to my poor Nutcracker, who is so unwell, and to shift for yourself on the sofa tonight. Remember that you're in excellent health yourself, as your round and rosy cheeks sufficiently prove. Moreover, a night is soon past, the sofa is very comfortable, and there will not be many dolls in Nuremberg as well lodged as yourself." Miss Clara, as you may well suppose, did not utter a word, but it struck Mary that she seemed very sulky and discontented. But Mary, whose conscience told her that she had treated Miss Clara in the most considerate manner, used no further ceremony with her, but drawing the bed towards her, placed the Nutcracker in it, covering him with the clothes up to the very chin. She then thought that she knew nothing as yet of the real disposition of Miss Clara, whom she had only seen for a few hours, but that as Miss Clara had appeared to be in a very bad humor at losing her bed, some evil might happen to the poor invalid if he were left with so insolent a person. She therefore placed the bed, with the Nutcracker in it, upon the second shelf, close by the ridge where Fritz's cavalry were quartered. Then, having laid Miss Clara upon the sofa, she closed the cupboard, and was about to rejoin Miss Trudchen in the bedchamber, when all around the room the poor girl heard a variety of low scratching sounds coming from behind the chairs, the store, and the cupboard. The large clock which hung against the wall, and which was surmounted by a large gilt owl, instead of a cuckoo, as is usual with old German clocks, began that usual whirring sound which gives warning of striking, and yet it did not strike. Mary glanced toward it, and saw that the immense gilt owl had dropped its wings in such a way that covered the entire clock, and that the bird thrust forward as far as it could its hideous cat-like head, with the round eyes and the crooked beak. Then the whirring sound of the clock became louder and louder, and gradually changed into the resemblance of a human voice, until it appeared as if these words issued from the beak of the owl. Clocks, clocks, clocks. Whir, 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 in a low tone. The king of the mice has a sharp ear. Sing him his old song, strike, 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 clocks all. Sound his last hour, for his fate is nigh at hand. And then, dong, 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 the clock struck 12 in a hollow and gloomy tone. Mary was very much frightened. She began to shudder from head to foot, and she was about to run away from the room when she beheld Godfather Drosselmeyer seated upon the clock instead of the owl, the two skirts of his coat having taken the place of the drooping wings of the bird. At that spectacle Mary remained nailed, as it were, to the spot with astonishment, and she began to cry, saying, "What are you doing up there, Godpapa Drosselmeyer? Come down here, and don't frighten me like that, naughty Godpapa Drosselmeyer." But at these words there began a sharp whistling and furious kind of tittering all around. Then, in a few moments, Mary heard thousands of little feet treading behind the walls, and next she saw thousands of little lights through the joints in the wainscot. When I say little lights, I am wrong. I mean thousands of little eyes. Mary full well perceived that there was an entire population of mice about to enter the room, and in fact, in the course of 5 minutes, thousands and thousands of mice made their appearance by the creases of the door and the joints of the floor, and began to gallop hither and thither, until at length they ranged themselves in order of battle, as Fritz was wont to draw upon his wooden soldiers. All this seemed very amusing to Mary, and as she did not feel towards mice that absurd alarm which so many foolish children experience, she thought she should divert herself with a sight, where there suddenly rang through the room a whistling so sharp, so terrible, and so long that a cold shudder passed over her. At the same time, a plank was raised up by some power underneath, and the king of the mice, with 7 heads, all wearing gold crowns, appeared at her very feet in the midst of the mortar and plaster that was broken up, and each of his 7 mouths began to whistle and scream horribly, while the body to which those 7 heads belonged forced its way through the opening. The entire army advanced towards the king, speaking with their little mouths 3 times in chorus. Then the various regiments marched across the room, directing their course towards the cupboard, and surrounding Mary on all sides so that she began to beat a retreat. I have already told you that Mary was not a timid child, but when she saw herself surrounded by crowds of mice, commanded by that monster with 7 heads, fear seized upon her, and her heart began to beat so violently that it seemed as if it would burst from her chest. Her blood appeared to freeze in her veins, her breath failed her, and half fainting she retreated with trembling steps. At length, purr, and the pieces of the panes in the cupboard, broken by her elbow which knocked against it, fell upon the floor. She felt at that moment an acute pain in the left arm, but at the same time her heart grew lighter, for she no longer heard that squeaking which had so much frightened her. Indeed, everything had again become quiet around her, and the mice had disappeared, and she thought that, terrified by the noises of the glass which was broken, they had sought refuge in their holes. But almost immediately afterwards a strange noise commenced in the cupboard, and numerous little sharp voices exclaimed, "To arms! To arms! To arms!" At the same time the music of Godfather Drosselmeyer's country house, which had been placed upon the top shelf of the cupboard, began to play, and on all sides she heard the words, "Quick! Rise to arms! To arms!" Mary turned round. The cupboard was lighted up in a wondrous manner, and all was bustle within. All the harlequins, the clowns, the punches, and the other puppets scampered about, while the dolls set to work to make lint and prepare bandages for the wounded. At length the Nutcracker himself threw off all the clothes and jumped off the bed, crying, "Foolish troop of mice, return to your holes, or you must encounter me." But at that minute a loud whistling echoed through the room, and Mary perceived that the mice had not returned to their holes, but that, frightened by the noise of the broken glass, they had sought refuge beneath the chairs and tables, whence they were now beginning to issue again. On his side, Nutcracker, far from being terrified by the whistling, seemed to gather fresh courage. "Despicable king of the mice!" he exclaimed. "It is thou, then. Thou acceptest the death which I have so long offered you? Come on, and let this night decide between us, and you, my good friends, my companions, my brethren. If it be indeed true that we are united in bonds of affection, support me in this perilous contest. On, on! Let those who love me follow." Never did a proclamation produce such an effect. 2 harlequins, a clown, 2 punches, and 3 other puppets cried out in a loud tone, "Yes, my lord, we are yours in life and death. We will conquer under your command or die with you." At these words, which proved that there was an echo to his speech in the heart of his friends, Nutcracker felt himself so excited that he drew his sword, and without calculating the dreadful height on which he stood, leapt from the second shelf. Mary, upon perceiving that dangerous leap, gave a piercing cry, for Nutcracker seemed on the point of being dashed to pieces, when Miss Clara, who was on the lower shelf, darted from the sofa and received him in her arms. "Ah, my dear little Clara," said Mary, clasping her hands together with emotion, "how have I mistaken your disposition?" But Miss Clara, thinking only of the present events, said to the Nutcracker, "What! My lord, wounded and suffering as you are plunging headlong into new dangers. Content yourself with commanding the army, and let the others fight. Your courage is known, and you can do no good by giving fresh proof of it." And as she spoke, Clara endeavored to restrain the gallant Nutcracker by holding him tight in her arms, but he began to struggle and kick in such a manner that Miss Clara was obliged to let him glide down. He slipped from her arms and fell on his knees at her feet in a most graceful manner, saying, "Princess, believe me, that although at a certain period you were unjust towards me, I shall always remember you, even in the midst of battle." Miss Clara stooped as low down as possible, and taking him by his little arm, compelled him to rise. Then, taking off her waistband, all glittering with spangles, she made a scarf of it, and sought to pass it over the shoulders of the young hero. But he, stepping back a few paces, and bowing at the same time in acknowledgment of so great a favor, untied the little white ribbon with which Mary had bound up his chin, and tied it round his waist, after pressing it to his lips. Then, light as a bird, he leapt from the shelf on the floor, brandishing his saber all the time. Immediately did the squeakings and creakings of the mice begin over again, and the king of the mice, as if to reply to the challenge of the Nutcracker, issued from beneath the great table in the middle of the room, followed by the main body of his army. At the same time, the wings, on the right and left, began to appear from beneath the armchair, under which they had taken refuge. The battle. "Trumpets, sound the charge! Drums, beat the alarm!" exclaimed the valiant Nutcracker. And at the same moment the trumpets of Fritz's hussars began to sound, while the drums of his infantry began to beat, and the rumbling of cannon was also heard. At the same time a band of musicians was formed, with fat Figaros with their guitars, Swiss peasants with their horns, and Negroes with their triangles. And all these persons, though not called upon by the Nutcracker, did not the less begin to descend from shelf to shelf, playing the beautiful march of the British Grenadiers. The music, no doubt, excited the most peaceably inclined puppets, for at the same moment a kind of militia commanded by the beadle of the parish was formed, consisting of harlequins, punches, clowns, and pantaloons. Arming themselves with anything that fell in their way, they were soon ready for battle. All was bustle, even to a man-cook, who, quitting his fire, came down with his spit, on which was a half-roasted turkey, and went and took his place in the ranks. The Nutcracker placed himself at the head of this valiant battalion, which to the shame of the regular troops was ready first. "I must tell you everything, or else you might think that I am inclined to be too favorable to that glorious militia. And therefore I must say that if the infantry and cavalry of Master Fritz were not ready so soon as the others, it was because they were all shut up in 4 boxes. The poor prisoners might therefore well hear the trumpet and drum which called them to battle. They were shut up and could not get out. Mary heard them stirring in their boxes like crayfish in a basket, but in spite of their efforts they could not free themselves. At length the grenadiers, less tightly fastened in than the others, succeeded in raising the lid of their box, and then helped to liberate the light infantry. In another instant they were free, and well knowing how useful cavalry is in a battle, they hastened to release the hussars, who began to canter gaily about, and ranged themselves 4 deep upon the flanks. But if the troops were thus somewhat behindhand in consequence of the excellent discipline in which Fritz maintained them, they speedily repaired the lost time. For infantry, cavalry, and artillery began to descend with the fury of an avalanche amidst the plaudits of Miss Rose and Miss Clara, who clapped their hands as they passed and encouraged them with their voices, as the lady from whom they were descended most likely were wont to do in the days of ancient chivalry. Meantime the king of the mice perceived that he had to encounter an entire army. In fact, the Nutcracker was in the center of his gallant band of militia. On the left was the regiment of hussars, waiting only the moment to charge. On the right was stationed a formidable battalion of infantry, while upon a footstool, which commanded the entire scene of battle, was a park of 10 cannon. In addition to these forces, a powerful reserve, composed of gingerbread men and warriors, made of sugar of different colors, had remained in the cupboard, and already began to bustle about. The king of mice had, however, gone too far to retreat, and he gave this signal by a squeak, which was repeated by all the forces under his command. At the same moment the battery on the footstool replied with a volley of shot amongst the masses of mice. The regiment of hussars rushed onward to the charge, so that on one side of the dust raised by their horses' feet, and on the other the smoke of the cannon concealed their plain of battle from the eyes of Mary. But in the midst of the roar of cannon, the shouts of the combatants, and the groans of the dying, she heard the voice of the Nutcracker ever rising above the din. "Sergeant Harlequin," he cried, "take 20 men and fall upon the flank of the enemy. Lieutenant Punch, form into a square. Captain Puppet, fire in platoons. Colonel of Hussars, charge in masses, and not 4 deep as you are doing. Bravo, good leaden soldiers, bravo! If all my troops behave as well as you, the day is ours." But by these encouraging words even Mary was at no loss to perceive that the battle was deadly, and that the victory remained doubtful. The mice, thrown back by the hussars, decimated by the fire of the platoons, and shattered by the park of artillery, returned again and again to the charge, biting and tearing all who came in their way. It was like the combats in the days of chivalry, a furious struggle foot to foot and hand to hand, each one bent upon attack or defense, without waiting to think of his neighbor. Nutcracker vainly endeavored to direct the evolutions in a disciplined manner and form his troops into dense columns. The hussars, assailed by numerous corps of mice, were scattered and failed to rally round their colonel. A vast battalion of enemy had cut them off from the main body of their army and had actually advanced up to the militia, which performed prodigies of valor. The beadle of the parish used his battle-axe most gallantly. The man-cook ran whole ranks of mice through with his spit. The leaden soldiers remained firm as wall. But Harlequin and his 20 men had been driven back and were forced to retreat under cover of the battery. And Lieutenant Punch's square had been broken up. The remains of his troops fled and threw the militia into disorder, and Captain Puppet, doubtless for want of cartridges, had ceased to fire and was in full retreat. In consequence of this backward movement through the line, the park of cannon was exposed, the king of the mice, perceiving that the success of the fight depended upon the capture of that battery, ordered his bravest troops to attack it. The footstool was accordingly stormed in a moment, and the artillerymen were cut to pieces by the side of their cannon. One of them set fire to his powder wagon and met an heroic death with 20 of his comrades. But all this display was useless against numbers, and in a short time a volley of shot fired upon them from their own cannon, and which swept the forces commanded by the Nutcracker, convinced him that the battery of the footstool had fallen into the hands of the enemy. From that moment the battle was lost, and the Nutcracker now thought only of beating an honorable retreat. But in order to give breathing time to his troops, he summoned the reserve to his aid. Thereupon the gingerbread men and the corps of sugar warriors descended from the cupboard and took part in the battle. They were certainly fresh, but very inexperienced troops. The gingerbread men especially were very awkward, and hitting right and left did as much injury to friends as to enemies. The sugar warriors stood firm, but they were of such different natures. Emperors, knights, Tyrolese peasants, gardeners, cupids, monkeys, lions, and crocodiles, that they could not combine their movements, and were strung only as a mass. Their arrival, however, produced some good, for scarcely had the mice tasted the gingerbread men and the sugar warriors when they left the leaden soldiers, whom they found very hard to bite, and turned also from the Punches, Harlequins, beadles, and cooks, who were only stuffed with bran, to fall upon the unfortunate reserve, which in a moment was surrounded by thousands of mice, and after an heroic defense, devoured arms and baggage. Nutcracker attempted to profit by that moment to rally his army, but the terrible spectacle of the destruction of the reserve had struck terror into the bravest hearts. Captain Puppet was as pale as death. Harlequin's clothes were in rags. A mouse had penetrated into Punch's hump, and like the youthful Spartan's fox, began to devour his entrails, and not only was the colonel of the hussars a prisoner with a large portion of his troops, but the mice had even formed a squadron of cavalry by means of horses thus taken. The unfortunate Nutcracker had no chance of victory left. He could not even retreat with honor, and therefore he determined to die. He placed himself at the head of a small body of men, resolved like himself to sell their lives dearly. In the meantime, terror reigned among the dolls. Miss Clara and Miss Rose wrung their hands and gave vent to loud cries. "Alas!" exclaimed Miss Clara, "must I die in the flower of my youth? I, the daughter of a king and born to such brilliant destinies?" "Alas!" said Miss Rose, "am I doomed to fall into the hands of the enemy and be devoured by the filthy mice?" The other dolls ran about in tears, their cries mingling with those of Miss Clara and Miss Rose. Meanwhile, matters went worse and worse with Nutcracker. He was abandoned by the few friends who had remained faithful to him. The remains of the squadron of hussars took refuge in the cupboard. The leaden soldiers had all fallen into the power of the enemy. The cannoneers had long previously been dispersed, and the militia was cut to pieces, like the 300 Spartans of Leonidas, without yielding a step. Nutcracker had planted himself against the lower part of the cupboard, which he vainly sought to climb up. He could not do so without the aid of Miss Rose or Miss Clara, and they had found nothing better to do than to faint. Nutcracker made a last effort, collected all his courage, and cried in agony of despair, "A horse, my kingdom for a horse!" But, as in the case of Richard III, his voice remained without even an echo, or rather betrayed him to the enemy. 2 of the rifle brigade of mice seized upon his wooden cloak, and at the same time the king of the mice cried with his 7 mouths, "On your heads, take him alive! Remember that I have my mother to avenge. This punishment must serve as an example to all future nutcrackers." And with these words the king rushed upon the prisoner. But Mary could no longer support that horrible spectacle. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker!" she exclaimed. "I love you with all my heart, and I cannot see you die thus." At the same moment, by a natural impulse and without precisely knowing what she was doing, Mary took off one of her shoes and threw it with all her force in the midst of the combatants. Her aim was so good that the shoe hit the king of the mice and made him roll over in the dust. A moment afterward, king and army, conquerors and conquered, all alike disappeared as if by enchantment. Mary felt a more severe pain than before in her arm. She endeavored to reach an armchair to sit down, but her strength failed her, and she fainted. The illness. When Mary awoke from her deep sleep, she found herself lying in her little bed, and the sun penetrated radiant and brilliant through the windows. By her side was seated a gentleman, whom she shortly perceived to be a surgeon named Vandelstern, and who said in a low voice, the moment she opened her eyes, "She is awake." Then the judge's wife advanced towards the bed, and gazed upon her daughter for a long time with an anxious air. "Ah, my dear mamma," exclaimed Mary, upon seeing her mother, "are all those horrible mice gone, and is my poor Nutcracker saved?" "For the love of heaven, my dear Mary, do not repeat all that nonsense," said the lady. "What have mice, I should like to know, to do with the Nutcracker? But you, naughty girl, have frightened us all sadly, and it is always so when children are obstinate and will not obey their parents. You played with your toys very late last night. You most likely fell asleep, and it is probable that a little mouse frightened you. At all events, in your alarm, you thrust your elbow through one of the panes of the cupboard and cut your arm in such a manner that Mr. Vandelstern, who has just extracted the fragments of glass, declares that you ran a risk of cutting an artery and dying through loss of blood. Heaven be thanked that I awoke. I know not at what o'clock, and that recollecting how I had left you in the room, I went down to look after you. Poor child, you were stretched upon the floor near the cupboard, and all around you were strewed the dolls, the puppets, the punches, the leaden soldiers, pieces of the gingerbread men, and Fritz's hussars, all scattered about pell-mell, while in your arms you held the Nutcracker. But how was it that you had taken off one of your shoes, and that it was at some distance from you?" "Ah, my dear mother," said Mary, shuddering as she thought of what had taken place, "all that you saw was caused by the great battle that took place between the puppets and mice, but the reason of my terror was that I saw the victorious mice about to seize upon the poor Nutcracker, who commanded the puppets, and it was then that I threw my shoe at the king of the mice. After that, I know not what happened." The surgeon made a sign to the judge's lady, who said in a soft tone to Mary, "Do not think any more of all that, my dear child. All the mice are gone, and the little Nutcracker is safe and comfortable in the glass cupboard." The judge then entered the room and conversed for a long time with the surgeon. But of all that they said, Mary could only catch these words, "It is delirium." Mary saw immediately that her story was not believed, but that it was looked upon as fable, and she did not say any more upon the subject, but allowed those around her to have their own way, for she was anxious to get up as soon as possible and pay a visit to the poor Nutcracker. She, however, knew she had escaped safe and sound from the battle, and that was all she cared about for the present. Nevertheless, Mary was very restless. She could not play on account of her wounded arm, and when she tried to read or look over her picture books, everything swam so before her eyes that she was obliged to give up the task. The time hung very heavily upon her hands, and she looked forward with impatience to the evening, because her mamma would come and sit by her, and tell her pleasant stories. One evening the judge's wife had just ended the pretty tale of Prince Farsidan, when the door opened, and Godfather Drosselmeyer thrust in his head, saying, "I must see with my own eyes how the little invalid gets on." But when Mary perceived Godfather Drosselmeyer, with his glass wig, his black patch, and his drab frock-coat, the remembrance of the night when the Nutcracker lost the famous battle against the mice returned so forcibly to her mind that she could not prevent herself from crying out, "Oh God, Papa Drosselmeyer, you were really very ugly. I saw you quite plainly when you were astride upon the clock, and when you covered it with your wings to prevent it from striking, because it would have frightened away the mice. I heard you call the king with the 7 heads. Why did you not come to the aid of my poor Nutcracker? Naughty Godpapa Drosselmeyer, for by not coming you were the cause of my hurting myself and having to keep to my bed." The judge's wife listened to all this with a kind of stupor, for she thought that the poor little girl was relapsing into delirium, and therefore said in a low tone of alarm, "What are you talking about, Mary? Are you taking leave of your senses?" "Oh, no," answered Mary, "and Godpapa Drosselmeyer knows that I am telling the truth." But the godfather, without saying a word, made horrible faces like a man who was sitting upon the thorns. Then, all of a sudden, he began to chant these lines in a gloomy sing-song tone. "Old clock bell beat, low, dull, and hoarse. Advance, retreat, though gallant force. The bell's lone sound proclaims around the hour of deep midnight, and the piercing note from the screech owl's throat puts the king himself to flight. Old clock bell beat, low, dull, and hoarse. Advance, retreat, though gallant force." Mary contemplated Godfather Drosselmeyer with increasing terror, for he now seemed to her more hideously ugly than usual. She would indeed have been dreadfully afraid of him if her mother had not been present, and if Fritz had not at that moment entered the room with a loud shout of laughter. "Do you know, Godpapa Drosselmeyer," said Fritz, "that you are uncommonly amusing today? You seem to move about just like my Punch that stands behind the store. And as for the song, it is not common sense." "My dear doctor," she said, "your song is indeed very strange, and appears to me to be only calculated to make little Mary worse." "Nonsense!" cried Godfather Drosselmeyer. "Do you not recognize the old chant which I am in the habit of humming when I mend your clocks?" At the same time he seated himself near Mary's bed, and said to her in a rapid tone, "Don't be angry with me, my dear child, because I did not tear out the 14 eyes of the king of the mice with my own hands, but I knew what I was about, and now, as I am anxious to make it up with you, I will tell you a story." "What story?" asked Mary. "The history of the Krakatuk nut and Princess Pirlipat. Do you know it?" "No, my dear godpapa," replied Mary, whom the offer of a story reconciled to the doctor that moment. "Go on." "My dear doctor," said the judge's wife, "I hope that your story will not be so melancholy as your song." "Oh, no, my dear lady," returned Godfather Drosselmeyer. "On the contrary, it is very amusing." "Tell it to us, then," cried both the children. Godfather Drosselmeyer accordingly began in the following manner. The history of the Krakatuk nut and Princess Pirlipat. how Princess Pirlipata was born, and how the event produced the greatest joy to her parents. There was lately in the neighborhood of Nuremberg a little kingdom which was not Prussia, nor Poland, nor Bavaria, nor Palatinate, and which was governed by a king. This king's wife, who was consequently a queen, became the mother of a little girl, who was therefore a princess by birth and received the sweet name of Pirlipata. The king was instantly informed of the event, and he hastened out of breath to see the pretty infant in her cradle. The joy which he felt in being the father of so charming a child carried him to such an extreme that, quite forgetting himself, he uttered loud cries of joy and began to dance around the room, crying, "Oh, who has ever seen anything so beautiful as my Pirlipatetta?" Then, as the king had been followed into the room by his ministers, his generals, the great officers of state, the chief judges, the counselors, and the puissant judges, they all began dancing around the room as the king, singing, "Great monarch, we never in this world did see a child so fair as the one that there has been given to thee. Oh, never was there child so fair." And indeed, although I may surprise you by saying so, there was not a word of flattery in all of this, for since the creation of the world, a sweeter child than Princess Pirlipata never has been seen. Her little face appeared to be made of the softest silken tissue, like the white rosy tints of the lily combined. Her eyes were of the purest and brightest blue, and nothing was more charming than to behold the golden thread of her hair, flowing in delicate curls over her shoulders, as white as alabaster. Moreover, Pirlipata, when born, was already provided with 2 complete rows of the most pearly teeth, with which 2 hours after her birth she bit the finger of the Lord Chancellor so hard, when being near-sighted he stooped down to look close at her, that although he belonged to the sect of Stoic philosophers, he cried out, according to some, "Oh, the Dickens!" whereas others affirmed to the honor of philosophy that he only said, "Oh, oh." However, up to the present day, opinions are divided upon this important subject, neither party being willing to yield to the other. Indeed, the only point on which the Dickensians and the Ohists are agreed is, that the princess really did bite the finger of the Lord Chancellor. The country thereby learnt that there was as much spirit as beauty belonging to the charming Pirlipata. Everyone was therefore happy in the kingdom so blessed by heaven, save the queen herself, who was anxious and uneasy, no person knew why. But what chiefly struck people with surprise was the care with which the timid mother had cradle of the infant watched. In fact, besides having all the doors guarded by sentinels, and in addition to the 2 regular nurses, the queen had 6 other nurses to sit round the cradle, and who were relieved by a half a dozen others at night. But what caused the greatest interest, and which no one could understand, was that each of these 6 nurses was compelled to hold a cat upon her knees, and to tickle it all night so as to prevent it from sleeping and keeping it purring. I am certain, my dear child, that you are as curious as the inhabitants of that little kingdom without a name to know why these extra nurses were forced to hold cats upon their knees and to tickle them in such a way that they should never cease purring. But as you would vainly endeavor to find out the secret of that enigma, I shall explain it to you in order to save you the headache which would not fail to be the result of your guesswork. It happened one day that half a dozen great kings took it into their heads to pay a visit to the future father of Princess Pirlipata, for at that time the princess was not born. They were accompanied by the royal princes, the hereditary grand dukes, and the heirs apparent, all most agreeable personages. This arrival was the signal for the king whom they visited, and who was a most hospitable monarch, to make a large drain upon his treasury, and give tournaments, feasts, and dramatic representations. But this was not all. He, having learnt from the intendant of the royal kitchen that the astronomer royal of the court was favorable for killing pigs, and the conjunction of the stars foretold that the year would be propitious for sausage-making, the king commanded a tremendous slaughter of pigs to take place in the courtyard. Then, ordering his carriage, he went in person to call upon all the kings and princes staying in his capital, and invite them to dine with him, for he was resolved to surprise them by the splendid banquet which he intended to give them. On his return to the palace, he retired to the queen's apartment, and going to her, said in a coaxing tone, with which he was always accustomed to make her do anything he wished, "My most particular and very dear love, you have not forgotten, have you, how dotingly fond I am of black puddings? You surely have not forgotten that." The queen understood by the first word what the king wanted of her. In fact, she knew by his cunning address that she must now proceed, as she had done many times before, to the very useful occupation of making with her own royal hands the greatest possible quantity of sausages, polonies, and black puddings. She therefore smiled at the proposal of her husband, for although filling with dignity the high situation of queen, she was less proud of the compliments paid her upon the manner in which she bore the scepter and the crown than of those bestowed on her skill in making a black pudding, or any other dish. She therefore contented herself by curtsying gracefully to her husband, saying that she was quite ready to make him the pudding which he required. The grand treasurer, accordingly, received orders to carry the immense enameled cauldron and the large silver saucepans to the royal kitchens, so that the queen might make the black puddings, the polonies, and the sausages. An enormous fire was made with sandalwood. The queen put on her apron of white damask, and in a short time delicious odors steamed from the cauldron. Those sweet perfumes spread through the passages, penetrated into all the rooms, and reached the throne room where the king was holding a privy council. The king was very fond of good eating, and the smell made a profound impression upon him. Nevertheless, as he was a wise prince and was famed for his habits of self-command, he resisted for a long time the feeling which attracted him towards the kitchens, but at last, in spite of the command which he exercised over himself, he was well compelled to yield to the inclination that now ruled him. "My lords and gentlemen," he accordingly said, rising from his throne, "with your permission, I will retire for a few moments. Pray wait for me." Then this great king hastened through the passages and corridors to the kitchen, embraced his wife tenderly, stirred the contents of the cauldron with his golden scepter, and tasted them with the tip of his tongue. Having thus calmed his mind, he returned to the council and resumed, though somewhat abstractedly, the subject of discussion. He had left the kitchen just at the important moment when the fat cut up in small pieces was about to be broiled upon the silver gridirons. The queen, encouraged by his praises, now commenced that important operation, and the first drops of grease had just dripped upon the live coals when a squeaking voice was heard to chant the following lines: "Dear sister, pray give to the queen of the mice a piece of that fat which is grilling so nice. To me a good dinner is something so rare that I hope of the fat you will give me a share." The queen immediately recognized the voice that thus spoke. It was the voice of Dame Mousie. Dame Mousie had lived for many years in the palace. She declared herself to be a relation of the royal family, and was queen of the kingdom of mice. She therefore maintained a numerous court beneath the kitchen hearthstone. The queen was a kind and good-natured woman, and although she would not publicly recognize Dame Mousie as a sister and a sovereign, she nevertheless showed her in private 1,000 flattering attentions. Her husband, more particular than herself, had often reproached her for thus lowering herself, but on the present occasion she could not find it in her heart to refuse the request of her little friend, and she accordingly said, "Come, Dame Mousie, without fear, and taste my pork fat as much as you like. I give you full leave to do so." Dame Mousie accordingly leapt upon the hearth, quite gay and happy, and took with her little paws the pieces of fat which the queen gave her. But behold the murmurs of joy which escaped the mouth of Dame Mousie, and the delicious smell of the morsels of fat on the gridiron reached her 7 sons, then her relations, and next her friends, all of whom were terribly addicted to gormandizing, and who now fell upon the fat with such fury that the queen was obliged, hospitable as she was, to remind them that if they continued at that rate only 5 minutes more, there would not be enough fat left for the black puddings. But in spite of the justice of the remonstrance, the 7 sons of Dame Mousie took no heed of them, and setting a bad example to their relations and friends, rushed upon their aunt's fat, which would have entirely disappeared had not the cries of the queen brought the man-cook and scullery boys, all armed with brushes and brooms, to drive the mice back again under the hearthstone. But the victory, although complete, came somewhat too late, for there scarcely remained a quarter enough fat necessary for the polonies, the sausages, and the black puddings. The remnant, however, was scientifically divided by the royal mathematician, who was sent for in all possible haste, between the large cauldron containing the materials for the puddings and the 2 saucepans in which the sausages and polonies were cooking. Half an hour after this event, the cannon fired, the clarions and trumpets sounded, and then came the potentates and the royal princes, the hereditary dukes, and their heirs apparent to the thrones, all dressed in their most splendid clothes, and some riding on gallant chargers. The king received them on the threshold of the palace in the most courteous manner possible. Then, having conducted them to the banqueting room, he took his seat at the head of the table, in his quality of sovereignhood, and having the crown upon his head, and the scepter in his hand. The guests all placed themselves at table according to their rank, as crowned kings, royal princes, hereditary dukes, or heir apparents. The board was covered with dainties, and everything went well during the soup and the first course. But when the polonies were placed on the table, the king seemed to be agitated. When the sausages were served up, he grew very pale. And when the black puddings were brought in, he raised his eyes to heaven. Sighs escaped his breast, and a terrible grief seemed to rend his soul. At length he fell back in his chair and covered his face with his hands, sobbing and moaning in so lamentable a manner that all the guests rose from their seats and surrounded him with great anxiety. At length the crisis seemed very serious. Court physician could not feel the beating of the pulse of the unfortunate monarch, who was thus overwhelmed with the weight of the most profound, the most frightful, and the most unheard of calamity. At length, upon the most violent remedies, such as burnt feathers, volatile salts, and cold keys thrust down the back, had been employed, the king seemed to return to himself. He opened his eyes and said in a scarcely audible tone, "Not enough fat." At these words, the queen grew pale in her turn. She threw herself at his feet, crying in a voice interrupted by sobs, "Oh, my unfortunate, unhappy, and royal husband, what grief have I not caused you by refusing to listen to the advice which you have so often given me? But you behold the guilty one at your feet, and you can punish her as severely as you think fit." "What is the matter?" demanded the king, "and what has happened that I know not of?" "Alas, alas," answered the queen, to whom her husband had never spoken in so cross a tone. "Alas, Dame Mousie, her 7 sons, her nephews, her cousins, and her friends devoured the fat." But the queen could not say any more. Her strength had failed her. She fell back and fainted. Then the king rose in a great rage and cried in a terrible voice, "Let her ladyship, the royal housekeeper, explain what all this means. Come, speak." Then the royal housekeeper related all that she knew, namely, that being alarmed by the queen's cries, she ran and beheld the majesty beset by the entire family of Dame Mousie, and that having summoned the cooks and scullery boys, the plunderers were compelled to retreat. The king, perceiving that this was a case of high treason, resumed all his dignity and calmness, and commanded the privy council to meet that minute, the matter being of the utmost importance. The council assembled, the business was explained, and it was decided by a majority of voices that Dame Mousie, being accused of having eaten the fat destined for the sausages, the polonies, and the black puddings of the king, should be tried for the same offense, and that, if the said Dame Mousie was found guilty, she and all her race should be banished from the kingdom, and all her good or possessions, namely lands, castles, palaces, and royal residences, should be confiscated. Then the king observed to his counselors that while the trial lasted, Dame Mousie and her family would have sufficient time to devour all the fat in the royal kitchens, which would expose him to the same privation as that which he had just endured in the presence of 6 crowned heads, without reckoning royal princes, hereditary dukes, and heirs apparent. He therefore demanded a discretionary power in respect to Dame Mousie and her family. The Privy Council divided for the form of the thing, but the discretionary power was voted, as you may well suppose, by a large majority. Then the king sent one of his best carriages, preceded by a courier, that greater speed might be used, to a very skillful mechanic who lived at Nuremberg, and whose name was Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. This mechanic was requested to proceed that moment to the palace upon urgent business. Christian Elias Drosselmeyer immediately obeyed, for he felt convinced that the king required him to make some work of art. Stepping into the vehicle, he traveled day and night until he arrived in the king's presence. Indeed, such was his haste that he had not waited to change the drab-colored coat, which he usually wore. But instead of being angry at the breach of etiquette, the king was much pleased with his haste. For if the famous mechanic had committed a fault, it was in his anxiety to obey the king's commands. The king took Christian Elias Drosselmeyer into his private chamber and explained to him the position of affairs, namely, that it was decided upon to make a striking example of the race of mice throughout the kingdom, that attracted by the fame of his skill, the king had fixed upon him to put the decree of justice into execution, and that the said king's only fears was lest the mechanic, skillful though he were, should perceive insurmountable difficulties in the way of appeasing the royal anger. But Christian Elias Drosselmeyer reassured the king, promising that in 8 days there should not be a single mouse left in the kingdom. In a word, that very same day he set to work to make several ingenious little oblong boxes, inside which he placed a morsel of fat at the end of a piece of wire. By seizing upon the fat, the plunderer, whoever he might be, caused the door to shut down behind him, and thus became a prisoner. In less than a week, 100 of these boxes were made and placed not only beneath the hearthstone, but in all garrets, lofts, and cellars of the palace. Dame Mousie was far too cunning and sagacious not to discover at the first glance the stratagem of Master Drosselmeyer. She therefore assembled her 7 sons, their nephews, and their cousins to warn them of the snare that was laid for them. But after having appeared to listen to her, and the veneration which her years commanded, they withdrew, laughing at her terrors. Then, attracted by the smell of fried pork fat, they resolved, in spite of the representations made to them, to profit by the charity that came they knew not whence. At the expiration of 24 hours, the 7 sons of Dame Mousie, 18 of her nephews, 50 of her cousins, and 235 of her other connections, without reckoning thousands of her subjects, were caught in the mouse traps and ignominiously executed. Then did Dame Mousie, with the remnant of her court and the rest of her subjects, resolve upon abandoning a place covered with blood of her massacred relatives and friends. The tidings of that resolution became known and reached the ears of the king. His Majesty expressed his satisfaction, and the poets of the court composed sonnets upon his victory, while the courtiers compared him to Sesostris, Alexander, and Caesar. The queen was alone and uneasy. She knew Dame Mousie well and suspected that she would not leave unavenged the death of her relations and friends. And in fact, at the very moment when the queen, by way of atoning for her previous fault, was preparing with her own hands a liver soup for the king, who doted upon that dish, Dame Mousie suddenly appeared and chanted the following lines. Thine husband, void of pity and fear, hath slain my cousins, sons, and nephews dear. But list, O queen, to the decrees of fate, the child which heaven will shortly give to thee, and which the object of thy love will be, shall bear the rage of my vindictive hate. Thine husband owneth castles, cannons, and towers, a council's wisdom, and an army's powers. mechanics, ministers, mousetraps, and snares. None of all these, alas, to me belong. But heaven hath given me teeth, sharp, firm, and strong, that I may rend in pieces royal airs. Having sung these words, she disappeared, and no one saw her afterwards. But the queen, who expected a little baby, was so overcome by the prophecy that she upset the liver soup into the fire. Thus, for the second time, was Dame Mousie the cause of depriving the king of one of his favorite dishes, whereat he fell into a dreadful rage. He, however, rejoiced more than ever at the step he had taken to rid his country of the mice. It is scarcely necessary to say that Christian Edward Drosselmeyer was sent away well rewarded and returned in triumph at Nuremberg. How, in spite of the precautions taken by the Queen, Dame Mousie accomplishes her threat in regard to Princess Pirlipata. And now, my dear children, you know as well as I do wherefore the Queen had Princess Pirlipata watched with such wonderful care. She feared the vengeance of Dame Mousie, for, according to what Dame Mousie had said, there could be nothing less in store for the heiress of this little kingdom without a name than the loss of her life, or at all events her beauty, which last affliction is considered by some people worse for one of her sex. What redoubled the fears of the Queen was that the machines invented by Master Drosselmeyer were totally useless against the experiences of Dame Mousie, the astronomer of the court, who was also grand prophet and grand astrologer, was fearful lest his office should be suppressed unless he gave his opinion at this important juncture. He accordingly declared that he read in the stars the great fact that the illustrious family of the cat Murr was alone capable of defending the cradle against the approach of Dame Mousie. It was for this reason that each of his 6 nurses was forced to hold a cat constantly upon her knees. Those cats might be considered as under-officers attached to the court, and the nurses sought to lighten the cares of the duty performed by the cats by gently rubbing them with their fair hands. You know, my dear children, that there are certain times when a person watches, even while actually dozing, and so it was that one evening, in spite of all the efforts which the 6 nurses made to the contrary, as they sat round the cradle of the princess with the cats upon their knees, they felt sleep rapidly gaining upon them. Now, as each nurse kept her own ideas to herself and was afraid of revealing them to their companions, hoping all the time that their drowsiness would not be perceived by others, the result was that one after another they closed their eyes, their hands stopped from stroking the cats, and the cats themselves, being no longer rubbed and scratched, profited by circumstance to take a nap. I cannot say how long this strange slumber had lasted, when towards midnight one of the nurses awoke with a start. All the others were in a state of profound lethargy. Not a sound, not even their very breathing was heard. The silence of death reigned around, broken only by the slight creak of the worm biting the wood. But now frightened was the nurse when she beheld a large and horrible mouse standing up near her on its hind legs, and, having plunged its head into the cradle, seemed very busy in biting the face of the princess. She rose with a cry of alarm, and at that exclamation all other nurses jumped up. But Dame Mousie, for she indeed it was, sprang towards one corner of the room. The cats leapt after her. Alas, it was too late. Dame Mousie had disappeared by a crevice in the floor. At the same moment, Princess Pirlipata, who was awoke by all that din, began to cry. Those sounds made the nurses leap with joy. "Thank God," they said, "since Princess Pirlipata cries, she is not dead." Then they all ran towards the cradle, but their despair was great indeed when they saw what had happened to the delicate and charming creature. In fact, instead of that face of softly blended white and red, that little head with its golden hair, those mild blue eyes azure as the sky itself, instead of all those charms the nurses beheld an enormous and misshapen head upon a deformed and ugly body. Her two sweet eyes had lost their heavenly hue, and became goggle, fixed and haggard. Her little mouth had grown from ear to ear, and her chin was covered with a beard like grizzly cotton. All this would have suited old Punch, but seemed very horrible for a young princess. At that moment the queen entered. The 12 nurses threw themselves with their faces against the ground, while the 6 cats walked about to discover if there were not some open window by which they might escape upon the tiles. At the sight of her child, the despair of the poor mother was something frightful to behold, and she was carried off in a fainting fit into the royal chamber. But it was chiefly the unhappy father whose sorrow was the most desperate and painful to witness. The courtiers were compelled to put padlocks upon the windows, for fear he should throw himself out, and they were also forced to line the walls with mattresses, lest he should dash out his brains against them. His sword was, of course, taken away from him, and neither knife nor fork nor any sharp or pointed instrument were left in his way. This was the more easily effected, inasmuch as he ate nothing for the 2 or 3 days following, crying without ceasing, "O miserable king that I am! O cruel destiny that thou art!" Perhaps instead of accusing destiny, the king should have remembered that, as is generally the case with mankind, he was the author of his own misfortunes, for had he known how to content himself with black pudding, containing a little less fat than usual, and had he abandoned his idea of vengeance, and left Dame Mousie and her family in peace beneath the hearthstone, the affliction which he deplored would not have happened. But we must confess that the ideas of the royal father of Princess Pirlipata did not tend at all in that direction. On the contrary, believing, as all great men do, that they must necessarily attribute their misfortunes to others, he threw all the blame upon the skillful mechanic, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, well convinced, moreover, that if he invited him back to the court to be hung or beheaded, he would not accept the invitation. He desired him to come in order to receive a new order of knighthood, which had just been created for men of letters, artists, and mechanics. Master Drosselmeyer was not exempt from human pride. He thought that a star would look well upon the breast of his drab surtout coat, and accordingly set off for the king's court. But his joy was soon changed into fear, for on the frontiers of the kingdom guards awaited him. They seized upon him and conducted him from station to station until they reached the capital. The king, who was afraid of being won over to mercy, would not see Master Drosselmeyer when the latter arrived at the palace, but he ordered him to be immediately conducted to the cradle of Pirlipata, with the assurance that if the princess were not restored by that day month to her former state of beauty, he would have the mechanic's head cut off. Master Drosselmeyer did not pretend to be bolder than his fellow men, and had always hoped to die a natural death. He was therefore much frightened at this threat. Nevertheless, trusting a great deal to his knowledge, which his own modesty had never prevented him being aware of to its full extent, he acquired courage. He then set to work to discover whether the evil would yield to any remedy, or whether it were really incurable as he had from the first believed it to be. With this object in view, he skillfully took off the head of the princess, and next all her limbs. He likewise dissected the hands and feet in order to examine, with more accuracy, not only the joints and the muscles, but also the internal formation. But alas, the more he worked into the frame of Pirlipata, the more firmly did he become convinced that as the princess grew, the uglier she would become. He therefore joined Pirlipata together again, and then seating himself by the side of her cradle, which he was not to quit until she had resumed her former beauty, he gave way to his melancholy thoughts. The 4th week had already commenced, and Wednesday made its appearance, when, according to custom, the king came in to see if any change had taken place in the exterior of the princess. But when he saw that it was just the same, he shook his scepter at the mechanic, crying, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, take care of yourself. You have only 3 days left to restore me my daughter just as she was wont to be. And if you remain obstinate in refusing to cure her, on Monday next you shall be beheaded." Master Drosselmeyer, who could not cure the princess, not through any obstinacy on his part, but through actual ignorance of how to do it, began to weep bitterly, surveying with tearful eyes Princess Pirlipata, who was cracking nuts as comfortably as if she was the most beautiful child upon the earth. Then, as he beheld that melting spectacle, the mechanic was struck for the first time by that particular taste for nuts which the princess had shown since her birth, and he remembered also the singular fact that she was born with teeth. In fact, immediately after her change from beauty to ugliness, she had begun to cry bitterly until she found a nut near her. She had then cracked it, eaten the kernel, and turned round to sleep quietly. From that moment the nurses had taken good care to fill their pockets with nuts and give her one or more whenever she made a face. O instinct of nature, eternal and mysterious sympathy of all created beings, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. Thou showest me the door which leads to the discovery of thy secrets. I will knock at it, and it will open. At these words, which surprised the king, the mechanic turned towards his majesty and requested the favor of being conducted into the presence of the astronomer of the court. The king consented, but on condition that it should be with a guard. Master Drosselmeyer would perhaps have been better pleased to take that little walk all alone, but as under the circumstance he could not help himself, he was obliged to submit to what he could not prevent, and process through the streets of the capital escorted like a felon. On reaching the house of the astrologer, Master Drosselmeyer threw himself into his arms, and they embraced each other amidst torrents of tears, for they were acquaintances of long standing, and were much attached to each other. They then retired to a private room and examined a great number of books which treated upon likings and dislikings, and a host of other matters, not a whit less profound. At length night came, and the astrologer, ascending to his tower, and aided by Master Drosselmeyer, who was himself very skilful in such matters, discovered, in spite of the difficulty of the heavenly circles which crossed each other in all directions, that in order to break the spell which rendered Princess Pirlipata hideous, and to restore her former beauty, she must eat the kernel of the Krakatuk nut, the shell of which was so hard that the wheel of a 48-pounder might pass over it without breaking it. Moreover, it was necessary that this nut should be cracked in the presence of the princess, and by a young man who had never been shaved, and who had always worn boots. Lastly, it was requisite that he should present the nut to the princess, with his eyes closed, and in the same way step 7 paces backward without stumbling. Such was the answer of the stars. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had worked without ceasing for 4 days and 4 nights to clear up this mysterious affair. It was on the Sunday evening the king had finished his dinner and was just beginning on the dessert when the mechanic, who was to be beheaded the next day, entered the royal dining room, full of joy, and announced that he had discovered the means of restoring Princess Pirlipata to her beauty. At these news, the king caught him in his arms with the most touching kindness and asked him what those means were. The mechanic thereupon explained to the king the result of his consultation with the astrologer. I knew perfectly well, Master Drosselmeyer, said the king, that all your delay was only through obstinacy. It is, however, settled at last, and after dinner we will set to work. Take care, then, dearest mechanic, to have the young man who has never been shaved and who wears boots in readiness in 10 minutes, together with the nut Krakatuk. Let him, moreover, abstain from drinking wine for the next hour, for fear he should stumble while walking backwards like a crab. But when once it is all over, tell him that he is welcome to my whole cellar and may get as tipsy as he chooses. But, to the great astonishment of the king, Master Drosselmeyer seemed quite frightened at these words. As he held his tongue, the king insisted upon knowing why he remained silent and motionless instead of hastening to execute the orders of his sovereign. Sire, replied the mechanician, throwing himself on his knees before the king, it is perfectly true that we have found the means of curing Princess Pirlipata, and that those means consist of eating a Krakatuk nut when it shall have been cracked by a young man who has never been shaved, and who has always worn boots. but we have not as yet either the young man or the nut. We know not where to find them, and in all probability we shall have the greatest difficulty in discovering both the nut and the nutcracker." At these words the king brandished his scepter above the head of the mechanician, crying, "Then hasten to the scaffold!" But the queen, on her side, hastened to kneel by the side of Master Drosselmeyer, and begged her august husband to remember that by cutting off the head of the mechanician, he would be losing even that ray of hope which remained to them during his lifetime. That the chances were that he who had discovered the horoscope would also find the nut in the nutcracker. That they ought to believe more firmly in the present prediction of the astronomer, inasmuch as nothing which he had hitherto prophesied had ever come to pass, but that it was evident his presages must be fulfilled some day or another, inasmuch as the king had named him his grand prophet, and that as the princess was not yet of an age to marry, she being now only 3 months old, and would not even be marriageable until she was 15, there was consequently a period of 14 years and 9 months during which Master Drosselmeyer and the astrologer might search after the Krakatuk nut and the young man who was to break it. The queen therefore suggested that a reprieve might be awarded to Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, at the expiration of which he should return to surrender himself into the king's powers, whether he had found the means of curing the princess or not, and either to be generously rewarded or put to death without mercy. The king, who was a very just man, and who on that day especially had dined splendidly upon his 2 favorite dishes, namely liver soup and black pudding, lent a favorable ear to the prayer of his wise and courageous queen. He therefore decided that the astrologer and the mechanician should that moment set out in search of the nut and the nutcracker, for which purpose he granted 14 years and 9 months, with the condition that they should return at the expiration of that reprieve to place themselves in his power, so that, if they were empty-handed, he might deal with them accordingly to his own royal pleasure. If, on the contrary, they should make their reappearance with the Krakatuk nut, which was to restore the princess to all her former beauty, the astrologer would be rewarded with a yearly pension of £600 and a telescope of honor, and the mechanician would receive a sword set with diamonds, the Order of the Golden Spider, the Grand Order of the State, and a new frock coat. As for the young man who was to crack the nut, the king had no doubt of being able to find one suitable for the purpose, by means of advertisements constantly inserted in the national and foreign newspapers. Touched by this declaration of the part of the king, which relieved them from half the difficulty of their task, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer pledged his honor that he would either find the Krakatuk nut or return, like another Regulus, to place himself in the hands of the king. That same evening the astrologer and the mechanician departed from the capital of the kingdom to commence their researches. How the mechanician and the astrologer wandered over the 4 quarters of the world and discover a 5th without finding the Krakatuk nut. It was now 14 years and 5 months since the astrologer and the mechanician first set out on their wanderings through all parts without discovering a vestige of what they sought. They had first of all traveled through Europe, then they visited America, next Africa, and afterward Asia, then even discovered a 5th part of the world, which learned men have since called New Holland, because it was discovered by 2 Germans. But throughout that long series of travels, although they had seen many nuts of different shapes and sizes, they never fell in with the Krakatuk nut. They had, however, alas, a vain hope, passed several years at the court of the King of Dates, and at that of the Prince of Almonds. They had uselessly consulted the celebrated Academy of Growl Monkeys and the famous Naturalist Society of Squirrels, until at length they arrived, sinking with fatigue, upon the borders of the great forest, which touches the feet of the Himalayan mountains. And now they dolefully said to each other that they had only 122 days to find what they sought, after a useless search of 14 years and 5 months. If I were to tell you, my dear children, the strange adventures which happened to the 2 travelers during that long wandering, I should occupy you every evening for an entire month, and should then weary you in the long run. I will therefore only tell you that Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, who was the most eager in search after the nut, since his head depended upon finding it, gave himself up to greater dangers than his companion, and lost all his hair by a stroke of the sun, received in the tropics. He also lost his right eye by an arrow, which a Caribbean chief aimed at him. Moreover, his drab frock coat, which was not new when he left Germany, had literally fallen into rags and tatters. His situation was therefore most deplorable, and yet so much do men cling to life, that damaged as he was by the various accidents which had befallen him, he beheld with increasing terror the approach of the moment when he must return to place himself in the power of the king. Nevertheless, the mechanician was a man of honor. He would not break a promise so sacred as that which he had made. He accordingly resolved, whatever might happen, to set out the very next morning on his return to Germany. And indeed, there was no time to lose. 14 years and 5 months had passed away, and the two travelers had only 122 days, as we have already said, to reach the capital of Princess Pirlipata's father. Christian Elias Drosselmeyer accordingly made known his noble intention to his friend the astrologer, and both decided that they would set out on their return the next morning. And true to this intention, the travelers resumed their journey at daybreak, taking the direction of Baghdad. From Baghdad, they proceeded to Alexandria, where they embarked for Venice. From Venice, they passed through the Tyrol, and from the Tyrol they entered into the kingdom of Pirlipata's father, both sincerely hoping that he was either dead or in his dotage. But alas, it was no such thing. Upon reaching the capital, the unfortunate mechanician learned that the worthy monarch not only had not lost his intellectual faculties, but was also in better health than ever. There was consequently no chance for him, unless Princess Pirlipata had become cured of her ugliness without any remedy at all, which was not possible, or that the king's heart had softened, which was not probable, of escaping the dreadful fate which threatened him. He did not, however, present himself the less boldly at the gate of the palace, for he was sustained by the idea that he was doing an heroic action, and he accordingly desired to speak to the king. The king, who was of easy access, and who gave an audience to whomsoever he had business with, ordered the Grand Master of the ceremonies to bring the strangers into his presence. The Grand Master of the ceremonies then stated that the strangers were of a most villainous appearance, and could not possibly be worse dressed. But the king answered that it was wrong to judge the heart by the countenance, and the gown did not make the person. Thereupon, the Grand Master of the ceremonies, having received the correctness of these observations, bowed respectfully and proceeded to fetch the mechanician and the astrologer. The king was the same as ever, and they immediately recognized him. But the travelers were so changed, especially poor Elias Drosselmeyer, that they were obliged to declare who they were. Upon seeing the two travelers return of their own accord, the king gave a sign of joy, for he felt convinced that they would not have come back if they had not found the Krakatuk nut. But he was speedily undeceived, and the mechanician, throwing himself at his feet, confessed that in spite of the most earnest and constant search, his friend and himself had returned empty-handed. The king, as we have said, although of a passionate disposition, was an excellent man at the bottom. He was touched by the punctuality with which Christian Elias Drosselmeyer had kept his word, and he changed the sentence of death long before pronounced against him into imprisonment for life. As for the astrologer, he contented himself by banishing that great sage. But as 3 days were still remaining of the period of 14 years and 9 months' delay granted by the king, Master Drosselmeyer, who was deeply attached to his country, implored the king's permission to profit by those 3 days to visit Nuremberg once more. This request seemed so just to the king that he granted it without any restriction. Master Drosselmeyer, having only 3 days left, resolved to profit by that time as much as possible, and having fortunately found that 2 places in the mail were not taken, he secured them that moment. Now, as the astrologer was himself condemned to banishment, and as it was all the same to him which way he went, he took his departure with the mechanician. Next morning, at about 10 o'clock, they were at Nuremberg. As Master Drosselmeyer had only one relation in the world, namely his brother, Christopher Zacharias Drosselmeyer, who kept one of the principal toy shops in Nuremberg, it was his house that he alighted. Christopher Zacharias Drosselmeyer was overjoyed to see his poor brother Christian Elias, whom he had believed to be dead. In the first instance, he would not admit that the man with the bald head and the black patch upon the eye was in reality his brother, but the mechanician showed him his famous drab surtout, which, all tattered as it was, had retained a certain part some traces of its original color, and in support of that first proof he mentioned so many family secrets unknown to all save Zacharias and himself that the toy merchant was compelled to yield to the evidence brought forward. He then inquired of him what had kept him so long absent from his native city, and in what country he had left his hair, his eye, and the missing pieces of his coat. Christian Elias Drosselmeyer had no motive to keep secret from his brother the events which had occurred. He began introducing his companion in misfortune, and, this formal usage having been performed, he related his adventures from A to Z, ending them by saying that he had only a few hours to stay with his brother, because not having found the Krakatuk nut, he was on the point of being shut up in a dungeon forever. While Christian Elias was telling his story, Christopher Zacharias had more than once twiddled his finger and thumb, turned round upon one leg, and made a certain knowing noise with his tongue. Under any other circumstances the mechanician would have demanded of him what those signs meant, but he was so full of thought that he saw nothing, and it was only when his brother exclaimed, "Ahem, ahem," twice, and "Oh, oh, oh," 3 times, that he asked the reason of those expressions. "The reason is," said Christopher Zacharias, "that it would be strange indeed if, but no, and yet." "What do you mean?" cried the mechanician. "If," continued the toy merchant. "If what?" again said Master Drosselmeyer. But instead of giving any answer, Christopher Zacharias, who was during those short questions and answers had no doubt collected his thoughts, threw his wig up into the air and began to caper about, crying, "Brother, you are saved! You shall not go to prison, for either I am much mistaken, or I myself am in possession of the Krakatuk nut." And without giving any further explanation to his astonished brother, Christopher Zacharias rushed out of the room, but returned in a moment with a box containing a large gilt filbert, which he presented to the mechanician. The mechanician, who dared not believe in such good luck, took the nut with hesitation, and turned it round in all directions so as to examine it with attention, which it deserved. He then declared that he was of the same opinion as his brother, and that he should be such astonished at the filbert, but not indeed the Krakatuk nut. Thus saying, he handed it to the astrologer and asked his opinion. The astrologer examined it with as much attention as Master Drosselmeyer had done, but shaking his head replied, "I should also be of the same opinion as yourself and brother, if the nut were not gilt, but I have not seen anything in the stars showing that the nut we are in search of ought to be so ornamented. Besides, how came your brother by the Krakatuk nut?" "I will explain the whole thing to you," said Christopher, "and tell you how the nut fell into my hands, and how it came to have gilding which prevents you from recognizing it, and which indeed is not its own naturally." Then, having made them sit down, for he very wisely thought that after traveling for 14 years and 9 months they must be tired, he began as follows. "The very day on which the king sent for you under the pretense of giving you an order of knighthood, a stranger arrived at Nuremberg carrying with him a bag of nuts, which he had to sell. But the nut merchants of this town, being anxious to keep the monopoly themselves, quarreled with him just opposite my shop. The stranger, with a view to defend himself more easily, placed his bag of nuts upon the ground, and the fight continued to the great delight of the little boys and the ticket porters. When a wagon, heavily laden, passed over the bag of nuts, upon seeing this accident, which they attributed to the justices of heaven, the merchants considered that they were sufficiently avenged, and left the stranger alone. He picked up his bag, and all his nuts were found to be cracked, save one, one only, which he handed to me with a strange kind of smile, requesting me to buy it for a new Zwanziger of the year 1720, and declaring that the day would come when I should not repent the bargain, dear as it might seem. I felt in my pocket, and as much surprised to find a Zwanziger of the kind mentioned by this man. The coincidence seemed so strange that I gave him my Zwanziger. He handed me the nut, and I took his departure. I placed the nut in my window for sale, and although I only asked 2 kreuzers, more than the money I had given for it, it remained in the window for 7 or 8 years without finding a purchaser. I then had it gilt to increase its value, but for that purpose I uselessly spent 2 Zwanzigers more, for the nut had been here ever since the day I bought it. At that moment the astrologer, in whose hands the nut had remained, uttered a cry of joy. While Master Drosselmeyer was listening to his brother's story, the astrologer had delicately scraped off some of the gilding of the nut, and on the shell had found the word Krakatuk engraven in Chinese characters. All doubts were now cleared up, and the 3 individuals danced for joy, the real Krakatuk nut being actually in their possession. How, after having found the Krakatuk nut, the mechanician and the astrologer find the young man who is to crack it. Christian Elias Drosselmeyer was in such a hurry to announce the good news to the king that he was anxious to return by the mail that very moment. But Christian Zacharias begged him to stay at least until his son should come in. The mechanician yielded the more easily to this request because he had not seen his nephew for 15 years, and because on recalling the idea of the past, he remembered that at the time when he quitted Nuremberg, he had left the said nephew a fine, fat, and romping fellow of only 3½ but of whom he, the uncle, was dotingly fond. While he was thinking of these things, a handsome young man of between 18 and 19 entered the shop of Christopher Zacharias, whom he saluted by the name of father. Then Christopher Zacharias, having embraced him, presented him to Christian Elias, saying to the young man, "And now embrace your uncle." The young man hesitated, for Uncle Drosselmeyer, with his frock coat and rags, his bald head, and the plaster upon his eye, did not seem a very inviting person. But his father observed the hesitation, and, as he was fearful that Christian Elias's feelings would be wounded, he pushed his son forward and thrust him into the arms of the mechanician. In the meantime, the astrologer had kept his eyes fixed upon the young man with a steady attention which seemed so singular that the youth felt ill at his ease in being so stared at, and left the room. The astrologer then put several questions to Christopher Zacharias concerning his son, and the father answered them with all the enthusiasm of a fond parent. Young Drosselmeyer was, as his appearance indicated, between 17 and 18. From his earliest years he had been so funny and yet so tractable that his mother had taken a delight in dressing him like some of the puppets which her husband sold, namely sometimes as a student, sometimes as a postilion, sometimes as a Hungarian, but always in a garb that required boots, because as he possessed the prettiest little feet in the world, but had a rather small calf, the boots showed off the little foot and concealed the fault of the calf. "And so," said the astrologer to Christopher Zacharias, "your son has always worn boots?" Christian Elias now stared in his turn. "My son has never worn anything but boots," replied the toy man. "At the age of 10, he continued, I sent him to the University of Tübingen, where he remained till he was 18, without contracting any of the bad habits of his companions, such as drinking, swearing, and fighting. The only weakness of which I believe him to be guilty is that he allows the 4 or 5 wretched hairs which he has upon his chin to grow, without permitting a barber to touch his countenance. And thus," said the astrologer, "your son has never been shaved?" Christian Elias stared more and more. "Never," answered Christopher Zacharias. "And during the holidays," continued the astrologer, "how did he pass the time?" "Why," replied the father, "he used to remain in the shop, in his becoming student's dress, and through pure good nature he cracked nuts for all the young ladies who came to the shop to buy toys and who on that account called him Nutcracker. "Nutcracker!" cried the mechanician. "Nutcracker!" repeated the astrologer in his turn. And then they looked at each other, while Christopher Zacharias looked at them both. "My dear sir," said the astrologer to the toyman, "in my opinion, your fortune is as good as made." The toyman, who had not heard this prophecy without a feeling of pleasure, required an explanation which the astrologer, however, put off until the next morning. When the mechanician and the astrologer were shown to their apartment and were alone together, the astrologer embraced his friend, crying, "It is he! We have him!" "Do you think so?" demanded Christian Elias, in the tone of a man who had his doubts, but who only wished to be convinced. "Can there be any uncertainty?" exclaimed the astrologer. "He has all the necessary qualifications. Let us sum them up. He has never worn anything but boots. True. He has never been shaved. True again. And through good nature he has stood in his father's shop to crack nuts for young persons who never called him by any other name than Nutcracker. All this is quite true." "My dear friend," added the astrologer, "one stroke of good luck never comes alone. But if you still doubt, let us go and consult the stars." They accordingly ascended to the roof of the house, and having drawn the young man's horoscope, discovered that he was intended for great things. This prophecy, which confirmed all the astrologer's hopes, forced the mechanician to adopt his opinion. "And now," said the astrologer in a triumphant tone, "there are only two things which we must not neglect." "What are they?" demanded Christian Elias. "The first is that you must fit to the nape of your nephew's neck a large piece of wood, which must be so well connected to the lower jaw that it will increase its power by the fact of pressure." "Nothing is more easy," answered Christian Elias. "It is the ABC of mechanics." "The second thing," continued the astrologer, "is that on arriving at the residence of the king, we must carefully conceal the fact that we have brought with us the young man who is destined to crack the Crackatuck nut. For my opinion is that the more teeth there are broken, and the more jaws there are dislocated in trying to break the Crackatuck nut, the more eager the king will be to offer a great reward to him who shall succeed where so have many failed." "My dear friend," answered the mechanician, "you are a man of sound sense. Let us go to bed." And with these words, having quitted the top of the house, they descended to their bedroom, where, having drawn their cotton nightcaps over their ears, they slept more comfortably than they had done for 14 years and 9 months past. On the following morning, at an early hour, the two friends went down to the apartment of Christopher Zacharias, and told him all the fine plans they had formed the evening before. Now, as the toyman was not wanting in ambition, and as in his paternal fondness he fancied that his son must certainly possess the strongest jaw in all Germany, he gladly assented to the arrangement, which was to take from his shop not only the nuts, but also the Nutcracker. The young man himself was more difficult to persuade. The wooden counterbalance which it was proposed to fix to the back of his neck, instead of the pretty little tie which kept his hair in such neat folds, particularly vexed him. But his father, his uncle, and the astrologer made him such splendid promises that he consented. Christian Elias Drosselmeyer therefore went to work that moment. The wooden balance was soon made, and it was strongly fixed to the nape of the young man, now so full of hope. Let me also state, to satisfy your curiosity, that the contrivance worked so well that on the very first the skillful mechanician received brilliant proofs of his success, for the young man was enabled to crack the hardest apricot stone and the most obstinate peach stones. These trials having been made, the astrologer, the mechanician, and young Drosselmeyer set out immediately for the king's dwellings. Christopher Zacharias was anxious to go with them, but as he was forced to take care of his shop, the excellent father resigned himself to necessity and remained behind at Nuremberg. End of the history of Princess Pirlipata. The mechanician, on reaching the capital, took good care to leave young Drosselmeyer at the inn where they put up. They then proceeded to the palace to announce that, having vainly sought the Crackatuck nut all over the world, they had at length found it at Nuremberg. But of him who was to crack it, they said not a word, according to the arrangement made between them. The joy at the palace was very great. the king sent directly for the privy councillor, who had the care of the public mind, and who acted as censor in respect to the newspapers. And this great man, by the king's command, drew up an article to be inserted into the Royal Gazette, and which all other newspapers were ordered to copy, to the effect that all persons who fancied that they had teeth good enough to break the Krakatuk nut were to present themselves at the palace, and, if they succeeded, would be liberally rewarded for their trouble. This circumstance was well suited to show how rich the kingdom was in strong jaws. The candidates were so numerous that the king was forced to form a jury, the foreman of whom was the crown dentist, and their duty was to examine all the competitors to see if they had all their 32 teeth perfect, and whether any were decayed. 3,500 candidates were admitted to this first trial, which lasted a week, and which produced only an immense number of broken teeth and jaws out of place. It was therefore necessary to make a second appeal, and all the national and foreign newspapers were crammed with advertisements to that purpose. The king offered the post of perpetual president of the Academy and the Order of the Golden Spider to whomsoever should succeed in cracking the Krakatuk nut. There was no necessity to have a degree of Doctor of Philosophy or Master of Arts to be competent to stand as a candidate. The second trial produced 5,000 candidates. All the learned societies of Europe sent deputies to this important assembly. Several members of the English Royal Society were present, and a great number of critics belonging to the leading London newspapers and literary journals. But they were not able to stand as candidates because their teeth had all been broken long before in their frequent attempts to tear to pieces the works of their brother authors. This second trial, which lasted a fortnight, was, alas, as fruitless as the first. The deputies of the learned societies disputed amongst themselves for the honor of the association to which they respectively belonged, as to whom should break the nut, but they only left their best teeth behind. As for the nut itself, its shell did not even bear the marks of the attempts that had been made to crack it. The king was in despair. He resolved, however, to strike one grand blow, and as he had no male descendant, he declared by means of a third article in the Royal Gazette, the national newspapers, and the foreign journals that the hand of Princess Pirlipata and the inheritance of the throne should be given to him who might crack the Krakatuk nut. There was one condition to this announcement, namely, that this time the candidate must be from 16 to 24 years of age. The promise of such a reward excited all Germany. Competitors poured in from all parts of Europe, and they would even have come from Asia, Africa, and America, and that fifth quarter of the world which had been discovered by Christian Elias Drosselmeyer and his friend the astrologer, if there had been sufficient time. On this occasion, the mechanician and the astrologer thought that the moment was now come to produce young Drosselmeyer, for it was impossible for the king to offer a higher reward than just announced. Only certain of success as they were, and although this time a host of princes and royal and imperial jaws had presented themselves, the mechanism and the astronomer did not appear with their young friend at the register office until just as it was about to close, so that the name Nathaniel Drosselmeyer was number 11,375 and stood last. It was on this occasion as on the preceding ones. The 11,374 rivals of young Drosselmeyer were foiled, and on the 19th day of the trial, at 25 minutes to 12 o'clock, and just as the princess accomplished her 15th year, the name of Nathaniel Drosselmeyer was called. The young man presented himself accompanied by his two guardians, the mechanician and the astrologer. It was the first time that these two illustrious persons had seen the princess since they had beheld her in the cradle, and since that period great changes had taken place with her. But I must inform you with due candor that those changes were not to her advantage. When a child, she was shockingly ugly. She was now frightfully so. Her form had lost, with its growth, none of its important features. It is therefore difficult to understand how those skinny legs, those flat hips, and that distorted body could have supported such a monstrous head. and that head had the same grizzled hair, the same green eyes, the same enormous mouth, and the same cotton beard on the chin, as we have already described, only all these features were just 15 years older. Upon perceiving that monster of ugliness, poor Nathaniel shuddered, and inquired of the mechanician and the astrologer if they were quite sure that the kernel of the Krakatuk nut would restore the princess to her beauty, because if she were to remain in that state, he was quite willing to make the trial in a matter where all the others had failed. He should leave the honor of the marriage and the profit of the heirship of the throne to anyone who might be inclined to accept them. It is hardly necessary to state that both the mechanician and the astrologer reassured their young friend, promising that the nut once broke and the kernel once eaten, Pirlipada would become that very moment the most beautiful princess on the face of the earth. But if the sight of Princess Pirlipada had struck poor Nathaniel with dismay, I must tell you, in honor of the young man, that his presence had produced a very different effect upon the sensitive heart of the heiress of the crown, and she could not prevent herself from exclaiming when she saw him, "Oh, how glad I should be if he were to break the nut!" Thereupon the chief governess of the princess replied, "I think I have often observed to your highness that it is not customary for a young and beautiful princess like yourself to express her opinion aloud relative to such matters." Nathaniel was indeed calculated to turn the heads of all the princesses in the world. He wore a little military frock coat of a violet color, all braided and with golden buttons, and which his uncle had made for this solemn occasion. His breeches were of the same stuff, and his boots were so well blacked and sat in such admirable manner that they seemed as if they were painted. The only thing which somewhat spoilt his appearance was the ugly piece of wood fitted to the nape of his neck, but Uncle Drosselmeyer had so contrived that it seemed like a little bag attached to his wig, and might at a stretch have passed as an eccentricity of the toilet, or else as a new fashion which Nathaniel's tailor was trying to push into the vogue at the court. Thus it was that when this charming young man entered the great hall, what the princess had the imprudence to say aloud, the other ladies present said to themselves, and there was not a person, not even excepting the king and the queen, who did not desire at the bottom of his heart that Nathaniel might prove triumphant in the adventure which he had undertaken. On his side, young Drosselmeyer approached with a confidence which encouraged the hopes that were placed in him. Having reached the steps leading to the throne, he bowed to the king and the queen, then to the Princess Pirlipada, and then to the spectators, after which he received the Krakatuk nut from the Grand Master of the ceremonies, took it delicately between his forefinger and thumb, placed it in his mouth, and gave a violent pull at the wooden balance hanging behind him. Crack, crack! And the shell was broken in several pieces. He then skillfully detached the kernel from the fibers hanging to it, and presented it to the princess, bowing gracefully but respectfully at the same time, after which he closed his eyes and began to walk backwards. At the same moment, the princess swallowed the kernel, and oh wonder! Her horrible ugliness disappeared, and she became a young lady of angelic beauty. Her face seemed to have borrowed the hues of the rose and the lily. Her eyes were of sparkling azure, and thick tresses resembling masses of golden thread flowed over her alabaster shoulders. The trumpets and the cymbals sounded enough to make one deaf, and the shouts of the people responded to the noise of the instruments. The king, the ministers, the counselors of state, and the judges began to dance as they had done at the birth of Pirlipada, and eau de Cologne was obliged to be thrown in the face of the queen, who had fainted for joy. The great tumult proved very annoying to young Nathaniel Drosselmeyer, who, as you must remember, had yet to step 7 paces backward. He, however, behaved with his coolness, which gave the highest hopes relative to the period when he should be called upon to reign in his turn, and he was just stretching out his leg to take the 7th step when the queen of the mice suddenly appeared through a crevice in the floor. With horrible squeaks she ran between his legs, so that just at that very moment, When the future Prince Royal placed his foot upon the ground, his heel came so fully on the body of the mouse that he stumbled in such a manner as to nearly fall. Oh, sorrow! At the same instant, the handsome young man became as ugly as the princess before him. His shrunken form could hardly support his enormous head. His eyes became green, haggard, and goggle. His mouth split from ear to ear, and his delicate little sprouting beard changed into a white and soft substance, which was afterward found to be cotton. But the cause of this event was punished at the same moment that she produced it. Dame Mousie was weltering in her own blood upon the floor. Her wickedness did not therefore go without its punishment. In fact, young Drosselmeyer had trampled so hard upon her with his heel that she was crushed beyond hope of recovery. But while still writhing on the floor, Dame Mousie squeaked forth the following words with all the strength of her agonizing voice. "Crack-a-took, crack-a-took, fatal nut that thou art. Through thee has death reached me at length with his dart. Hi-ho, hi-ho, but the queen of the mice has thousands to back her, and my son will yet punish this wretched Nutcracker. I know, I know. Sweet life, adieu, too soon snatched away. And thou heaven of blue, and thou world so gay, adieu, adieu." The verses of Dame Mousie might have been better, but one cannot be very correct, as you will agree, when breathing the last sigh. And when that last sigh was rendered, a great officer of the court took Dame Mousie by the tail and carried her away for the purpose of interring her remains in the hole where so many of her family had been buried 15 years and some months beforehand. As in the middle of all of this, no one had troubled themselves about Nathaniel Drosselmeyer except the mechanician and the astrologer. The princess, who was unaware of the accident which had happened, ordered the young hero to be brought into her presence, for in spite of the lesson read to her by her governess, she was in haste to thank him. But scarcely had she perceived the unfortunate Nathaniel than she hid her face in her hands, and forgetting the services which he had rendered her, cried, "Turn out the horrible Nutcracker! Turn him out! Turn him out!" The Grand Marshal of the palace accordingly took poor Nathaniel by the shoulders and pushed him down the stairs. The king, who was very angry at having a Nutcracker proposed to him as his son-in-law, attacked the astrologer and the mechanician, and instead of the income of £600 a year and the telescope of honor which he had promised the first, instead also of the sword set with diamonds, the order of the golden spider, and the drab frock coat, which he ought to have given the latter, he banished them both from his kingdom, granting them only 24 hours to cross the frontiers. Obedience was necessary. The mechanician and the astrologer and young Drosselmeyer, now become a Nutcracker, left the capital and quitted the country. But when night came, the two learned men consulted the stars once more, and read in them that, all deformed though he were, Nathaniel would not the less become a prince and king, unless indeed he chose to remain a private individual, which was left to his own choice. This was to happen when his deformity should disappear, and that deformity would disappear when he should have commanded an army in battle, when he should have killed the 7-headed king of the mice, who was born after Dame Mousie's 7 first sons, and been put to death, and lastly, when a beautiful lady should fall in love with him. But while awaiting these brilliant destinies, Nathaniel Drosselmeyer, who had left the paternal shop as the only son and heir, now returned to it in the form of a Nutcracker. I need scarcely tell you that his father did not recognize him, and that when Christopher Zacharias inquired of the mechanician and his friend the astrologer what had become of his dearly beloved son, those two illustrious persons replied, with the seriousness of learned men, that the king and the queen would not allow the savior of the princess to leave them, and that young Nathaniel remained at court covered with honor and glory. As for the unfortunate Nutcracker, who felt how deeply painful was his situation, he uttered not a word, but resolved to await patiently the change which must some day or another take place in him. Nevertheless, I must candidly admit that in spite of the good nature of his disposition, he was desperately vexed with Uncle Drosselmeyer, who, coming at a moment he was so little expected, and having enticed him away by so many fine promises as the sole and only cause of the frightful misfortune that had occurred to him. Such, as my dear children, is the history of the Krakatuk nut, just as Godfather Drosselmeyer told it to little Mary and Fritz. And you can now understand why people often say, when speaking of anything difficult to do, that is a hard nut to crack. The uncle and the nephew. If any one of my young friends now around me has ever cut himself with glass, which he has most likely done in the days of his disobedience, he must know by experience that it is a particularly disagreeable kind of cut, because it is so long in healing. Mary was therefore forced to stay a whole week in bed, for she always felt giddy whenever she tried to get up. But at last she got well altogether and was able to skip about the room as she was wont to do. You would not do my little heroine the injustice to suppose that her first visit was to any other place than the glass cupboard, which now seemed quite charming to look at. A new pane had been put in, and all the windows had been so well cleaned by Miss Trudchen that all the trees, houses, dolls, and other toys of the Christmas Eve seemed quite new, gay and polished. But in the midst of all the treasures of her little kingdom, and before all other things, Mary perceived her Nutcracker smiling upon her from the second shelf where he was placed, and with his teeth all in as good order as ever they were. While thus joyfully examining her favorite, an idea which had more than once presented itself to the mind of Mary touched her to the quick. She was persuaded that all Godfather Drosselmeyer had told her was not a mere fable, but the true history of the disagreement between the Nutcracker on one side and the late Queen of the Mice and her son, the reigning king, on the other side. She therefore knew that the Nutcracker could be neither more nor less than Nathaniel Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, the amiable but enchanted nephew of her godfather, for that the skillful mechanician who had figured at the court of Pirlipata's father was Dr. Drosselmeyer. She had never doubted from the moment when he introduced his drab frock coat into his tale. This disbelief was strengthened when she found him losing first his hair by a sunstroke and then his eye by an arrow, events which had rendered necessary the invention of the ugly black patch and of the ingenious glass wig, of which I have already spoken. "But why did not your uncle help you, poor Nutcracker?" said Mary, as she stood at the glass cupboard, gazing up at her favorite, for she remembered that on the success of the battle depended the disenchantment of the poor little man and his elevation to the rank of king of the kingdom of toys. Then she thought that all the dolls, puppets, and little men must be well prepared to receive him as their king, for did they not obey the Nutcracker as soldiers obey a general? That indifference on the part of Godfather Drosselmeyer was so much the more annoying to little Mary because she was certain that those dolls and puppets to which, in her imagination, gave life and motion, really did live and move. Nevertheless, there was now no appearance of either life or motion in the cupboard, where everything was still and quiet. But Mary, rather than give up her sincere belief, thought that all this was occasioned by the sorcery of the late Queen of the Mice and her son, and so firm was she in this belief that while she gazed up at the Nutcracker, she continued to say aloud what she had only begun to say to herself. "And yet," she resumed, "although you are unable to move and are prevented by enchantment from saying a single word to me, I am very sure, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, that you understand me perfectly, and that you are well aware of my good intentions with regard to you. Reckon then upon my support when you require it, and in the meantime do not vex yourself. I will go straight to your uncle and beg him to assist you, and if he only loves you a little, he is so clever that I am sure he can help you." In spite of the eloquence of this speech, the Nutcracker did not move an inch, but it seemed to Mary that a sigh came from behind the glass, the panes of which began to sound very low, but wonderfully soft and pleasing, while it appeared to Mary that a sweet voice, like a small silver bell, said, "Dear little Mary, thou art my guardian angel. I will be thine, and Mary shall be mine." And at these words, so mysteriously heard, Mary felt a singular sensation of happiness, in spite of the shudder which passed through her entire frame. Twilight had now arrived, and the judge returned home, accompanied by Dr. Drosselmeyer. In a few moments, Miss Trudchen got tea ready, and all the family were gathered round the table, talking gaily. As for Mary, she had been to fetch her little armchair, and had seated herself in silence at the feet of Godfather Drosselmeyer. Taking advantage of a moment when no one was speaking, she raised her large blue eyes toward the doctor, and looking earnestly at him, said, "I now know, dear godpapa, that my Nutcracker is your nephew, young Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. He has become a prince, and also a king of the kingdom of toys, as your friend the astrologer prophesied. But you know that he is at open war with the king of the mice. Come, dear godpapa, tell me why you did not help him when you were sitting astride upon the clock, and why do you now desert him?" And with these words, Mary again related, amidst the laughter of her father, her mother, and Miss Trudchen, the events of that famous battle which she had seen. Fritz and Godfather Drosselmeyer alone did not enjoy the whole scene. "Where," said the godfather, "does that little girl get all those foolish ideas which enter her head?" "She has a very lively imagination," replied Mary's mother. "And after all, these are only dreams and visions occasioned by fever." "And I can prove that," shouted Fritz, "for she says that my red hussars took to flight, which cannot possibly be true, unless indeed they are abominable cowards, in which case they would not get the better of me, for I would flog them all soundly." Then, with a singular smile, Godfather Drosselmeyer took Mary upon his knee, and said, with more kindness than before, "My dear child, you do not know what course you are pursuing in espousing so warmly the cause of your Nutcracker. You will have to suffer much if you persist in taking the part of one who is in disgrace, for the king of the mice, who considers him to be the murderer of his mother, will persecute him in all ways. But in any case, remember that it is not I, but you alone, who can save him. Be firm and faithful, and all will go well." Neither Mary nor anyone else understood the words of Godfather Drosselmeyer. On the contrary, those words seemed so strange to the judge that he took the doctor's hand, felt his pulse for some moments in silence, and then said, "My dear friend, you are very feverish, and I should advise you to go home to bed." The Duel. During the night which followed the scene just related, and while the moon, shining in all its splendor, cast its bright rays through the openings in the curtain, Mary, who now slept with her mother, was awakened by a noise that seemed to come from the corner of the room, and was mingled with sharp screeches and squeakings. "Alas!" cried Mary, who remembered to have heard the same noise on the occasion of the famous battle. "Alas, the mice are coming again! Mamma, mamma, mamma!" But her voice was stifled in her throat, in spite of all of her efforts. She endeavored to get up to run out of the room, but seemed to be nailed to her bed, unable to move her limbs. At length, turning her affrighted eyes toward the corner of the room, when the noise came, she beheld the king of the mice scraping for himself a way through the wall, and thrusting in first one of his heads, then another, then a third, and so on, until the whole 7, each with a crown, made their appearance. Having entered the room, he walked several times round it like a victor who takes possession of his conquest. He then leapt with one bound upon a table that was standing near the bed. Gazing upon her with his 14 eyes, all as bright as carbuncles, and with the gnashing of his teeth and a horrible squeaking noise, he said, "Fay, fa, fum! You must give me all your sugar plums and your sweet cakes, little girl. And if not, I will eat up your friend the Nutcracker." Then, having uttered his threat, he fled from the room by the same hole as he had entered by. Mary was so frightened by this terrible apparition that she awoke in the morning very pale and broken-hearted, the more so that she dared not mention what had taken place during the night, for fear of being laughed at. 20 times was she on the point of telling all, either to her mother or to Fritz, but she stopped, still thinking that neither the one nor the other would believe her. It was, however, pretty clear that she must sacrifice her sugar plums and her sweet cakes to the safety of the poor Nutcracker. She accordingly placed them all on the ledge of the cupboard that very evening. Next morning the judge's wife said, "I really do not know whence come all the mice that have suddenly invaded the house, but those naughty creatures have actually eaten up all my poor little Mary's sugar plums." The lady was not quite right. The sugar plums and cakes were only spoilt, not eaten up, for the glutinous king of the mice, not finding the sweet cakes as good as he expected, messed them about so that they were forced to be thrown away. But as it was not sugar plums that Mary liked best, she did not feel much regret at the sacrifice which the king of the mice had extorted from her, and thinking that he would be contented with the first contribution with which had taxed her, she was much pleased at the idea of having saved Nutcracker upon such good terms. Unfortunately, her satisfaction was not of long duration, for the following night she was again awoke by hearing squeaking and whining close by her ears. Alas, it was the king of the mice again, his eyes shining more horribly than on the preceding night, and, in a voice interrupted by frequent whines and squeaks, he said, "You must give me your little sugar dolls and figures made of biscuit, little girl. If not, I will eat up your friend the Nutcracker." Thereupon the king of the mice went skipping away and disappeared by the hole in the wall. Next morning, Mary, now deeply afflicted, went straight to the glass cupboard and threw a mournful look upon her figures of sugar and biscuit. And her grief was very natural, for never were such nice-looking sweet things seen before. "Alas," she said, as she turned towards the Nutcracker, "what would I not do for you, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer? But you must admit all the same that what I am required to do is very hard." At these words the Nutcracker assumed so piteous an air that Mary, who fancied that she was for ever beholding the jaws of the king of the mice opening to devour him, resolved to make this second sacrifice to save the unfortunate young man. That very evening, therefore, she placed her sugar figures and her biscuits upon the ledge of the cupboard, where the night before she had put her sugar plums and sweet cakes. Kissing them, however, one after another as a token of farewell, she yielded up her shepherds and her shepherdesses and her sheep, concealing behind the flock, at the same time, a little sugar baby with fat round cheeks, and which she loved above all the other things. "Now really, this is too bad," cried the judge's wife next morning. "It is very clear that these odious mice have taken up their dwelling in the glass cupboard, for all poor Mary's sugar figures are eaten up." At these words large tears started from Mary's eyes, but she dried them up almost directly, and even smiled sweetly as she thought to herself, "What matter my shepherds, shepherdesses, and sheep, since the Nutcracker is saved?" "Mamma," cried Fritz, who was present at the time, "I must remind you that our baker has an excellent gray cat, which we might send for, and which would soon put an end to all this by snapping up the mice one after another, and even Dame Mousie herself afterwards, as well as her son the king." "Yes," replied the judge's wife, "but the same cat would jump upon the table and shelves and break my glasses and cups to pieces." "Oh, there is no fear of that," cried Fritz. "The baker's cat is too polite to do any such thing, and I wish I could walk along the pipes and the roofs of houses as skillfully as he can." "No cats here, if you please," cried the judge's wife, who could not bear those domestic animals. "But, after all," said the judge, who overheard what was going on, "some good may follow from the remarks of Fritz. If you will not have a cat, get a mouse trap." "Capital!" cried Fritz. "That idea is very happy since Godpapa Drosselmeyer invented mouse traps." Everyone now laughed, and as, after a strict search, no such thing as a mousetrap was found in the house, the servants went to Godfather Drosselmeyer, who sent back a famous one, which was baited with a bit of bacon and placed in the spot where the mice had made such havoc. Mary went to bed with the hope that morning would find the king of the mice a prisoner in the box, to which his gluttony was almost certain to lead him. But at about 11 o'clock, and while she was in her first sleep, she was awoke by something cold and velvety that leapt about her arms and face, and at the same moment the whining and squeaking which she knew so well rang in her ears. The horrible king of the mice was there, seated on her pillow, with his eyes shooting red flames, and his 7 mouths wide open, as if he were about to eat poor Mary up. "I laugh at the trap, I laugh at the trap," said the king of the mice. "I shall not go into the little house, and the bacon will not tempt me. I shall not be taken. I laugh at the trap. But you must give me your picture books and your little silk frock. If not, I will eat up your friend the Nutcracker." You can very well understand that after such a demand as this, Mary awoke in the morning with her heart full of sorrow and her eyes full of tears. Her mother, moreover, told her nothing new when she said that the trap had remained empty, and that the king of the mice had suspected the snare. Then, as the judge's wife left the room to see after the breakfast, Mary entered her papa's room, and going up to the cupboard said, "Alas, my dear good Mr. Drosselmeyer, where will all this end? When I have given my picture books to the king of the mice to tear, and my pretty little frock, which my guardian angel sent me, to rend into pieces, he will not be content, but will every day be asking me for more. And when I have nothing else left to give him, he will perhaps eat me up in your place. Alas, what can a poor little girl like me do for you, dear, good Mr. Drosselmeyer? What can I do?" While Mary was weeping and lamenting in this manner, she observed that the Nutcracker had a drop of blood upon his neck. From the day when she had discovered that her favorite was the son of the toyman and the nephew of the doctor, she had left off carrying him in her arms, and had neither kissed nor caressed him. Indeed, so great was her timidity in this respect, that she had not even dared to touch him with the tip of the finger. But at this moment, seeing that he was hurt and fearing lest his wound might be dangerous, she took him gently out of the cupboard and began to wipe away with her handkerchief the drop of blood which was upon his cheek. But how great was her astonishment when she suddenly felt the Nutcracker moving about in her hands. She replaced him quickly upon the shelf. His lips quivered from ear to ear, which made his mouth seem larger still, and by dint of trying to speak, he concluded by uttering the following words: "Ah, dear Miss Silberhaus, excellent friend, what do I not owe you? And how much gratitude have I to express to you? Do not sacrifice for me your picture books and your silk frock, but get me a sword, a good sword, and I will take care of the rest." The Nutcracker would have said more, but his words became unintelligible. His voice sank altogether, and his eyes, for a moment animated by an expression of the softest melancholy, grew motionless and vacant. Mary felt no alarm. On the contrary, she leapt for joy, for she was very happy at the idea of being able to save the Nutcracker without being compelled to give up her picture books or her silk frock. One thing alone vexed her, and that was where could she find the good sword that the little man required. Mary resolved to explain her difficulty to Fritz, who, in spite of his blustering manners, she knew to be a good-natured boy. She accordingly took him up close to the glass cupboard, told him all that had happened between the Nutcracker and the king of the mice, and ended by explaining the nature of the service she required of him. The only thing which made a great impression upon Fritz was the idea that his hussars had really acted in a cowardly manner in the thickest of the battle. He therefore asked Mary if the accusations were really true, and as he knew that she never told a story, He believed her words. Then rushing up to the cupboard, he made a speech to his soldiers, who seemed quite ashamed of themselves. But this was not all. In order to punish the whole regiment in the person of its officers, he degraded them one after the other, and expressly ordered the band not to play the Hussars' March during parade. Then turning to Mary, he said, "As for the Nutcracker, who seems to me to be a brave little fellow, I think I can manage his business. For as I put a veteran major of horse guards upon half pay yesterday, he having finished his time in the service, I should think he cannot want his sword any longer. It is an excellent blade, I can assure you." It now remained to find the major. A search was commenced, and he was found living on his half pay in a little tavern, which stood in a dark corner of the third shelf in the cupboard. As Fritz had imagined, he offered no objection to give up his sword, which had become useless to him, and which was that instant fastened to the Nutcracker's neck. The fear which Mary now felt prevented her from sleeping all the next night, and she was so wide awake that she heard the clock strike 12 in the room where the cupboard was. Scarcely had the hum of the last stroke ceased, when strange noises came from the direction of the cupboard. And then there was a great clashing of swords, as if two enemies were fighting in mortal combat. Suddenly one of the duelists gave a squeak. "The King of the Mice!" cried Mary, full of joy and terror at the same time. Then there was a dead silence. But presently someone knocked gently, very gently, at the door, and a pretty little voice said, "Dearest Miss Silberhaus, I have glorious news for you. Open the door, I beseech you." Mary recognized the voice of young Drosselmeyer. She hastily put on her little frock and opened the door. The Nutcracker was there, holding the blood-stained sword in his right hand and a candle in his left. The moment he saw Mary, he knelt down and said, "It is you alone, O dearest lady, who have nerved me up with the chivalrous courage which I have just shown, and who gave me strength to fight that insolent wretch who dared to threaten you. The vile King of the Mice is bathed in his blood. Will you, O lady, deign to accept the trophies of the victory, trophies that are offered by the hand of a knight who is devoted to you until death?" With these words the Nutcracker drew from his left arm the 7 gold crowns of the King of the Mice, which he had placed there as if they were bracelets, and which he now offered to Mary, who received them with joy. The Nutcracker, encouraged by this amiability on her part, then rose and spoke. "Oh, dear Miss Silberhaus, now that I have conquered my enemy, what beautiful things can I show you, if you would have the condescension to go with me only for a few paces hence. Oh, do not refuse me, dear lady, I implore you." Mary did not hesitate a moment to follow the Nutcracker, knowing how great were her claims upon his gratitude, and being quite certain that he had no evil intention towards her. "I will follow you," she said, "my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, but you must not take me very far, nor keep me long away, because I have not yet slept a wink." "I will choose the shortest, although the most difficult path," said the Nutcracker, and thus speaking he led the way, Mary following him. The Kingdom of Toys. They both reached in a short time a large old cupboard standing in a passage near the door, and which was used as a clothes press. There the Nutcracker stopped, and Mary observed to her great astonishment that the folding doors of the cupboard, which were nearly always kept shut, were now wide open, so that she could see plainly her father's traveling cloak lined with fox-skin, which was hanging over the other clothes. The Nutcracker climbed very skillfully along the border of the cloak, and clinging to the braiding, he reached the large cape, which, fastened by a piece of lace, fell over the back of the cloak. From beneath this cape the Nutcracker drew down a pretty little ladder of cedar wood, which he placed in such a manner that the foot touched the bottom of the cupboard, and the top was lost in the sleeve of the cloak. "Now, dear young lady," said the Nutcracker, "have the goodness to give me your hand and ascend with me." Mary complied, and scarcely had she glanced up the sleeve when a brilliant light burst upon view, and she suddenly found herself transported into the mists of a fragrant meadow, which glittered as if it were strewed with precious stones. "Oh, how charming!" cried Mary, dazzled by the sight. "Where are we?" "We are in the field of sugar candy, miss, but we will not remain here unless you wish to do so. Let us pass through this door." Then Mary observed a beautiful gate through which they left the field. The gate seemed to be made of white marble, red marble, and blue marble, but when Mary drew near it, she saw that it was made of preserves, candied orange peels, burnt almonds, and sugared raisins. This was the reason, as she learnt from the Nutcracker, why that gate was called the Gate of Burnt Almonds. The gate opened into a long gallery, the roof of which was supported by pillars of barley sugar. In the gallery there were 5 monkeys, all dressed in red, and playing music, which, if it were not the most melodious in the world, was at least the most original. Mary made so much haste to see more that she did not even perceive that she was walking upon a pavement of pistachio nuts and macaroons, which she took for marble. At length she reached the end of the gallery, and scarcely was she in the open air when she found herself surrounded by the most delicious perfumes, which came from a charming little forest that opened before her. This forest, which would have been dark were it not for the quantity of lamps that it contained, was lighted up in so brilliant a manner that it was easy to distinguish the golden and silver fruits, which were suspended to branches ornamented with white ribbons and nosegays resembling marriage favors. "Oh, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer," cried Mary, "what is the name of this charming place, I beseech you?" "We are now in the forest of Christmas, miss," answered the Nutcracker, "and it is here that people come to fetch the trees to which the presents sent by the guardian angels are fastened." "Oh," continued Mary, "may I not remain here one moment? Everything is so nice here and smells so sweet." The Nutcracker clapped his hands together, and several shepherds and shepherdesses, hunters and huntresses, came out of the forest, all so delicate and white that they seemed made of refined sugar. They carried on their shoulders an armchair made of chocolate encrusted with angelica, in which they placed a cushion of jujube, inviting Mary most politely to sit down. Scarcely had she done so, when as at operas the shepherds and shepherdesses, the hunters and huntresses, took their places and began to dance a charming ballet to an accompaniment of horns and bugles, which the hunters blew with such good will that their faces became flushed just as if they were made of conserve of roses. Then the dance being finished, they all disappeared in a grove. "Pardon me, dear Miss Silverhouse," said the Nutcracker, holding out his hand toward Mary. "Pardon me for having exhibited to you so poor a ballet, but those simpletons can do nothing better than repeat over and over again the same step. As for the hunters, they blew their bugles as if they were afraid of them, and I can promise you that I shall not let it pass so quietly. But let us leave those creatures for the present and continue our walk, if you please." "I really found it all very delightful," said Mary, accepting the invitation of the Nutcracker. "And it seems to me, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, that you are harsh towards the little dancers." The Nutcracker made a face as much as to say, "We shall see, but your plea in their favor shall be considered." They then continued their journey and reached a river which seemed to send forth all the sweet scents that perfumed the air. "This," said the Nutcracker, without even waiting to be questioned by Mary, "is the river of orange juice. It is one of the smallest in the kingdom, for save in respect to its sweet odor, it cannot be compared to the river of lemonade, which falls into the southern sea, or the sea of punch. The lake of Sweet Whey is also finer. It joins the northern sea, which is called the Sea of Milk of Almonds." At a short distance was a little village in which the houses, the church, and the parsonage were all brown. The roofs, however, were gilt, and the walls were resplendent with incrustations of red, blue, and white sugar plums. "This is the village of Sweet Cake," said the Nutcracker. "It is a pretty little place, as you perceive, and is situate on the streamlet of honey." The inhabitants are very agreeable to look upon, but they are always in a bad humor, because they are constantly troubled with the toothache. But my dear Miss Silberhaus, continued the Nutcracker, do not let us stop at all the villages and little towns of the kingdom. To the capital! To the capital! The Nutcracker advanced, still holding Mary's hand, but walking more confidently than he hitherto had done, for Mary, who was full of curiosity, kept by his side, light as a bird. At length, after the expiration of some minutes, the odor of roses was spread through the air, and everything around them now seemed to be of a rose tint. Mary remarked that this was the perfume and the reflection of a river of essence of roses, which flowed along, its waves rippling melodiously. Upon the sweet-scented waters, silver swans with collars of gold round their necks swam gently along, warbling the most delicate songs, so that this harmony, with which they were apparently much pleased, made the diamond fishes leap up around them. "Ah," cried Mary, "this is the pretty river which Godpapa Drosselmeyer made me at Christmas, and I am the girl who played with the swans." The journey. The Nutcracker tapped his hands together once more, and at the moment the river of essence of roses began to rise visibly, and from its swelling waves came forth a chariot made of shells and covered with precious stones that glittered in the sun. It was drawn by golden dolphins and 4 charming little Moors, with caps made of scales of goldfish, and clothes of hummingbirds' feathers leapt upon the bank. They first carried Mary and then the Nutcracker very gently down to the chariot, which instantly began to advance upon the stream. You must confess that it was a ravishing spectacle, and one which might even be compared to the voyage of Cleopatra upon the Cydnus, which you read of in Roman history, to behold little Mary in the chariot of shells, surrounded by perfume and floating on the waves of essence of roses. The golden dolphins that drew the chariot tossed up their heads and threw into the air the glittering jets of rosy crystal, which fell in variegated showers of all the colors of the rainbow. Moreover, that pleasure might penetrate every sense, a soft music began to echo round, and sweet silvery voices were heard singing in the following manner. "Who art thou thus floating where essence of rose and a stream of sweet perfume deliciously flows? Art thou the fairies' queen? Say, dear little fishes that gleam in the tide, or answer, ye cygnets that gracefully glide upon that flood serene." And all this time the little Moors, who stood behind the seat on the chariots of shells, shook 2 parasols hung with bells, in such a manner that those sounds formed an accompaniment to the vocal melody, and Mary, beneath the shade of the parasols, leant over the waters, each wave of which, as it passed, reflected her smiling countenance. In this manner she traversed the river of essence of roses, and reached the bank on the opposite side. Then, when they were within an oar's length of the shore, the little Moors leapt, some into the water, others on the bank, the whole forming a chain so as to convey Mary and the Nutcracker ashore upon a carpet of angelica, all covered with mint drops. The Nutcracker now conducted Mary through a little grove, which was perhaps prettier than the Christmas forest. So brilliantly did each tree shine, and so sweetly did they all smell, with their own peculiar essence. But what was most remarkable was the quantity of fruits hanging to the branches. Those fruits being not only of singular color and transparency, some yellow as the topaz, others red like the ruby, but also of a wondrous perfume. "We are now in the wood of preserved fruits," said the Nutcracker, "and beyond that boundary is the capital." And as Mary thrust aside the last branches, she was stupefied at beholding the extent, the magnificence, and the novel appearance of the city, which rose before her upon a mound of flowers. Not only did the walls and steeples glitter with the most splendid colors, but in respect to the shape of the buildings, it was impossible to see any so beautiful upon the earth. The fortifications and the gates were built of candied fruits, which shone in the sun with their own gay colors, all rendered more brilliant still by the crystallized sugar that covered them. At the principal gate, which was the one by which they entered, silver soldiers presented arms to them, and a little man clad in a dressing gown of gold brocade threw himself into the Nutcracker's arms, crying, "Oh, dear Prince, have you come at length? Welcome, welcome to the city of candied fruits." Mary was somewhat astonished at the great title given to the Nutcracker, but she was soon drawn from her surprise by the noise of an immense quantity of voices all chattering at the same time, so that she asked the Nutcracker if there were some disturbance or some festival in the kingdom of toys. "There is nothing of all that, dear Miss Silverhouse," answered the Nutcracker. "But the city of candied fruits is so happy a place, and all its people are so joyful, that they are constantly talking and laughing. And this is always the same as you see it now. But come with me, let us proceed, I implore of you." Mary, urged by her own curiosity and by the polite invitation of the Nutcracker, hastened her steps, and soon found herself in a large marketplace, which had seen the most magnificent aspects that could possibly be seen. All the houses around were of sugar, open with fretwork, and having balcony over balcony. And in the middle of the marketplace was an enormous cake, from the inside of which flowed 4 fountains, namely, lemonade, orangeade, sweet milk, and gooseberry syrup. The basins around were filled with whipped syllabub, so delicious in appearance that several well-dressed persons publicly ate of it by means of spoons. But the most agreeable and amusing part of the whole scene was the crowd of little people who walked about, arm in arm by the thousands and tens of thousands, all laughing, singing, and chattering at the top of their voices, so that Mary could now account for the joyous din which she had heard. Besides the inhabitants of the capital, there were men of all countries, Armenians, Jews, Greeks, Tyrolese, officers, soldiers, clergymen, monks, shepherds, punches, and all kinds of funny people, such as one meets with in the world. Presently the tumult redoubled at the entrance of a street looking upon the great square, and the people stood aside to allow the cavalcade to pass. It was the great mogul who was carried upon a palanquin, attended by 93 lords of his kingdom, and 700 slaves. But at the same time it happened that from the opposite street the Grand Sultan appeared on horseback, followed by 300 janissaries. The 2 sovereigns had always been rivals, and therefore enemies, and this feeling made it impossible for their attendants to meet each other without quarreling. It was even much worse, as you may well suppose, when those 2 powerful monarchs found themselves face to face. In the first place, there was a great confusion, from the midst of which the citizens sought to save themselves. But cries of fury and despair were soon heard, for a gardener in the act of running away had knocked off the head of a Brahmin, greatly respected by his own class, and the Grand Sultan's horse had knocked down a frightened Punch, who endeavored to creep between the animal's legs to get away from the riot. The din was increasing when the gentleman in the gold brocade dressing-gown, who had saluted the Nutcracker by the title of Prince at the gate of the city, leapt to the top of the huge cake with a single bound, and having rung a silvery sweet-toned bell 3 times, cried out 3 times, "Confectioner! Confectioner! Confectioner!" That instant did the tumult subside, and the combatants separate. The Grand Sultan was brushed, for he was covered with dust. The Brahmin's head was fixed on, with the injunction that he must not sneeze for 3 days, for fear it should fall off again, and order was restored. The pleasant sports began again, and everyone hastened to quench his thirst with the lemonade, the orangeade, the sweet milk, or the gooseberry syrup, and to regale himself with the whipped syllabub. "My dear Mr. Drosselmeyer," said Mary, "what is the cause of the influence exercised upon those little folks by the word confectioner repeated thrice?" "I must tell you, miss," said the Nutcracker, "that the people of the city of candied fruits believe, by experience, in the transmigration of souls, and are in the power of a superior principle called confectioner, which principle can bestow on each individual what form he likes by merely baking, for a shorter or longer period, as the case may be. Now, as everyone believes his own existing shape to be the best, he does not like to change it. Hence, the magic influence of the word confectioner upon the head of the city of candied fruits when pronounced by the chief magistrate. It is sufficient, as you perceive, to appease all that tumult. Everyone in an instant forgets earthly things, broken ribs, and bumps upon the head, and, restored to himself, says, "What is man, and what may he not become?" While they were thus talking, they reached the entrance of the palace, which shed around a rosy lustre, and was surmounted by 100 light and elegant towers. The walls were strewed with nosegays of violets, narcissi, tulips, and jasmine, which set off with their various hues the rose-colored ground from which they stood forth. The great dome in the center was covered with thousands of gold and silver stars. "Oh, heavens!" exclaimed Mary. "What is that wonderful building?" "The Palace of Sweet Cake," answered the Nutcracker, "and it is one of the most famous monuments in the capital of the Kingdom of Toys." Nevertheless, lost in wonder as she was, Mary could not help observing that the roof of one of the great towers was totally wanting, and that the little gingerbread men, mounted on a scaffold of cinnamon, were occupied in repairing it. She was about to question the Nutcracker relative to this accident, when he said, "Alas, it is only a disgrace, if not with absolute ruin. The giant glutton ate up the top of that tower, and he was already on the point of biting the dome when the people hastened to give him, as a tribute, the quarter of the city called Almond and Honey Cake District. However, with a large portion of the forest of Angelica, in consideration of which he agreed to take himself off without making any worse ravages than those which you see." At that moment a soft and delicious music was heard. The gates of the palace opened themselves, and 12 little pages came forth, carrying in their hands branches of aromatic herbs, lighted like torches. Their heads were made of pearl, 6 of them had bodies made of rubies, and the 6 others of emeralds, wherewith they trotted joyously along upon 2 little feet of gold, sculptured with all the taste and care of Benvenuto Cellini. They were followed by 4 ladies about the same size as Miss Clara, Mary's new doll, but all so splendidly dressed and so richly adorned that Mary was not at a loss to perceive in them the royal princesses of the city of preserved fruits. They all 4, upon perceiving the Nutcracker, hastened to embrace him with the utmost tenderness, exclaiming at the same time, and, as it were, with one voice, "Oh, Prince, dear, dear brother!" The Nutcracker seemed much moved. He wiped away the tears which flowed from his eyes, and taking Mary by the hand, said in a feeling tone to the 4 princesses, "My dear sisters, this is Miss Silberhaus, whom I now introduce to you. She is the daughter of Chief Justice Silberhaus of Nuremberg, a gentleman of the highest respectability. It is this young lady who saved my life, for if at the moment when I lost a battle she had not thrown her shoe at the king of the mice, and again if she had not afterward lent me the sword of a major whom her brother had placed on the half-pay list, I should even now be sleeping in my tomb, or what is worse, be devoured by the king of the mice." "Ah, my dear Miss Silberhaus," cried the Nutcracker, with an enthusiasm which he could not control. "Pirlipada, although the daughter of a king, was not worthy to unloose the latchet of your pretty little shoes." "Oh, no, no, certainly not," repeated the 4 princesses in chorus. And throwing their arms around Mary's neck, they cried, "Oh, noble liberatrix of our dear and much-loved prince and brother! Oh, excellent Miss Silberhaus!" And with these exclamations, which their heartfelt joy cut short, the 4 princesses conducted the Nutcracker and Mary into the palace, and made them sit down upon beautiful little sofas of cedar wood, covered with golden flowers, and then insisted upon preparing a banquet with their own hands. With this object they hastened to fetch a number of little vases and bowls, made of the finest Japanese porcelain, and silver knives, forks, spoons, and other articles of the table. They then brought in the finest fruits and most delicious sugar plums that Mary had ever seen, and began to bustle about so nimbly that Mary was at no loss to perceive how well they understood everything connected with cooking. Now, as Mary herself was well acquainted with such matters, she wished inwardly to take a share in all that was going on, and, as if she understood Mary's wishes, the most beautiful of the Nutcracker's 4 sisters handed her a little golden mortar, saying, "Dear Liberatrix of my brother, pound me some sugar candy, if you please." Mary hastened to do as she was asked, and while she was pounding the sugar candy in the mortar, when a delicious music came forth, the Nutcracker began to relate all his adventures. But strange as it was, it seemed to Mary during that recital as if the words of young Drosselmeyer and the noise of the pestle came gradually more and more indistinct to her ears. In a short time she seemed to be surrounded by a light vapor turned into a silvery mist, which spread more and more densely around her, so that it presently concealed the Nutcracker and the princesses from her sight. Strange songs, which reminded her of those she had heard on the river of essence of roses, met her ears, commingled with the increasing murmur of waters. And then Mary thought the waves flowed beneath her, raising her up in their swell. She felt as if she were rising high up, higher and higher, when suddenly down she fell from a precipice that she could not measure. Conclusion. One does not fall several thousand feet without waking. Thus it was that Mary awoke, and on awaking, she found herself in her little bed. It was broad daylight, and her mother, who was standing by her, said, "Is it possible to be so lazy as you are? Come, get up and dress yourself, dear little Mary, for breakfast is waiting." "Oh, my dear mamma," said Mary, opening her eyes wide with astonishment, "whither did young Mr. Drosselmeyer take me last night? And what splendid things did he show me?" And then Mary related all that I have just told you. And when she had done, her mother said, "You have had a very long and charming dream, my dear little Mary. But now that you are awake, you must forget it all and come and have your breakfast." But Mary, while she dressed herself, persisted in maintaining that she had really seen all of which she spoke. Her mother accordingly went to the cupboard and took out the Nutcracker, who, according to custom, was upon the 3rd shelf. Bringing it to her daughter, she said, "How can you suppose, silly child, that this puppet, which is made of wood and cloth, can be alive and move or think?" "But, my dear mamma," said Mary perpetually, "I am well aware that the Nutcracker is none other than young Mr. Drosselmeyer, the nephew of godpapa." At that moment Mary heard a loud shout of laughter behind her. It was the Judge Fritz and Mrs. Trudchen, who made themselves merry at her expense. "Ah," cried Mary, "how can you laugh at me, dear papa, and at my poor Nutcracker? He spoke very respectfully of you, nevertheless, when we went to the Palace of Sweet Cake, and he introduced me to his sisters." The shouts of laughter redoubled to such an extent that Mary began to see the necessity of giving some proof of the truth of what she said, for fear of being treated as a simpleton. She therefore went into the adjoining room and brought back a little box in which she had carefully placed the 7 crowns of the King of the Mice. "Here, mamma," she said, "are the 7 crowns of the King of the Mice, which the Nutcracker gave me last night as a proof of his victory." The judge's wife, full of surprise, took the 7 little crowns, which were made of an unknown but very brilliant metal, and were carved with a delicacy of which human hands were incapable. The judge himself could not take his eyes off them, and considered them to be so precious that, in spite of the prayers of Fritz, he would not let him touch one of them. The judge and his wife then pressed Mary to tell them whence came those little crowns, but she could only persist in what she had already said. And When her father, annoyed at what he had heard, and at what he considered obstinacy on her part, called her a little storyteller, she burst into tears, exclaiming, "Alas, unfortunate child that I am! What would you have me tell you?" At that moment the door opened, and the doctor made his appearance. "What is the matter?" he said. "And what have they done to my little goddaughter that she cries and sobs like this? What is it? What is it all?" The judge acquainted Dr. Drosselmeyer with all that had occurred, and when the story was ended, he showed him the 7 crowns. But scarcely had the doctor seen them when he burst out laughing and said, "Well, really, this is too good. These are the 7 crowns that I used to wear to my watch chain some years ago, and which I gave to my goddaughter on the occasion of her 2nd birthday. Do you not remember, my dear friend?" But the judge and his wife could not recollect anything about the presents stated to have been given. Nevertheless, believing what the godfather said, their countenances became more calm. Mary, upon seeing this, ran up to Dr. Drosselmeyer, saying, "But you know all. Godpapa, confess that the Nutcracker is your nephew, and that it was he who gave me the 7 crowns." But Godfather Drosselmeyer did not at all seem to like these words, and his face became so gloomy that the judge called little Mary to him, and taking her upon his knees, said, "Listen to me, my dear child, for I wish to speak to you very seriously. Do me the pleasure, once for all, to put an end to these silly ideas, because if you should again assert that this ugly and deformed Nutcracker is the nephew of our friend the doctor, I give you due warning that I will throw not only the Nutcracker, but all the other toys, Miss Clara amongst them, out of the window." Poor Mary was therefore unable to speak any more of all the fine things with which her imagination was filled. But you can well understand that when a person has once traveled in such a fine place as the Kingdom of Toys, and seen such a delicious town as the City of Preserved Fruits, were it only for an hour, it is not easy to forget such sights. Mary therefore endeavored to speak to her brother of the whole business, but she had lost all of his confidence since the moment when she had said that his hussars had taken to flight. Convinced, therefore, that Mary was a storyteller, as her father had so said, he restored his officers to the rank from which he had reduced them, and allowed the band to play as usual the Hussars' March, a step which did not prevent Mary from entertaining her own opinion relative to their courage. Minnie dared not therefore speak further of her adventures. Nevertheless, the remembrance of the Kingdom of Toys followed her without ceasing, and when she thought of all that, she looked upon it as if she were still in the Christmas forest, or on the river of essence of roses, or in the City of Preserved Fruits, so that instead of playing with her toys as she had been wont to do, she remained silent and pensive, occupied only with her own thoughts, while everyone called her the little dreamer. But one day, when the doctor, with his wig laid upon the ground, his tongue thrust into one corner of his mouth, and the sleeve of his yellow coat turned up, was mending a clock by the aid of a long pointed instrument, it happened that Mary, who was seated near the glass cupboard contemplating the Nutcracker, and buried in her own thoughts, suddenly said, quite forgetful that both the doctor and her mamma were close by, "Ah, my dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, if you were not a little man made of wood, as my papa declares, and if you were really alive, I would not do as Princess Pirlipat did, and desert you, because in serving me you had ceased to be a handsome young man, for I love you sincerely." But scarcely had she uttered these words, when there was such a noise in the room that Mary fell off her chair in a fainting fit. And when she came to herself, she found that she was in the arms of her mother, who said, "How is it possible that a great girl like you, I ask, can be so foolish as to fall off your chair?" And just at that moment, too, when young Mr. Drosselmeyer, who has finished his travels, arrives at Nuremberg. "Come, wipe your eyes and be a good girl." Indeed, as Mary wiped her eyes, the door opened, and Godpapa Drosselmeyer, with his glass wig upon his head, his hat under his arm, and his drab frock coat upon his back, entered the room. He wore a smiling countenance, and held by the hand a young man who, although very little, was handsome. This young man wore a superb frock coat of red velvet embroidered with gold, white silk stockings, and shoes brilliantly polished. He had a charming nosegay on the bosom of his shirt, and was very dandified with his curls and hair powder. Moreover, long tresses, neatly braided, hung behind his back. The little sword that he wore by his side was brilliant with precious stones, and the hat which he carried under his arm was of the finest silk. The amiable manners of this young man showed who he was directly, for scarcely had he entered the room when he placed at Mary's feet a quantity of magnificent toys and nice confectionery, chiefly sweet cake and sugar plum, the finest she had ever tasted, save in the kingdom of toys. As for Fritz, the doctor's nephew seemed to have guessed his martial taste, for he brought him a sword with the blade of the finest Damascus steel. At the table, when the dessert was placed upon it, the amiable youth cracked nuts for all the company. The hardest could not resist his teeth for a moment. He placed them in his mouth with his right hand. With the left he pulled his hair behind, and crack! The shell was broken. Mary had become very red when she first saw that pretty little gentleman, but she blushed deeper still when, after the dessert, he invited her to go with him into the room where the glass cupboard was. "Yes, go, my dear children, and amuse yourselves together," said Godpapa Drosselmeyer. "I do not want that room any more today, since all the clocks of my friend the judge now go well." The two young people proceeded to the room, but scarcely was young Drosselmeyer alone with Mary when he fell upon one knee and spoke thus: "My dear Miss Silberhaus, you see at your feet the happy Nathaniel Drosselmeyer, whose life you saved on this very spot. You also said that you would not have repulsed me as Princess Pirlipada did, if, in serving you, I had become hideous. Now as the spell which the Queen of the Mice threw upon me was destined to lose all its power on that day when, in spite of my ugly face, I should be beloved by a young and beautiful girl, I at that moment ceased to be a vile nutcracker, and resumed my proper shape, which is not disagreeable, as you may see. Therefore, my dear young lady, if you still possess the same sentiments in respect to myself, do me the favor to bestow your much-loved hand upon me. Share my throne and my crown, and reign with me over the kingdom of toys, of which I ere now become the king." Then Mary raised young Drosselmeyer gently and said, "You are an amiable and a good king, sir, and as you have moreover a charming kingdom, adorned with magnificent palaces, and possessing a very happy people, I receive you as my future husband, provided my parents give their consent." Thereupon, as the door of the room had opened very gently, without the two young folks having heard it, so occupied were they with their own sentiments, the judge, his wife, and Godpapa Drosselmeyer came forward, crying, "Bravo!" with all their might, which made Mary as red as a cherry. But the young man was not abashed, and advanced towards the judge and his wife. He bowed gracefully to them, paid them a handsome compliment, and ended by soliciting the hand of Mary in marriage. The request was immediately granted. That same day Mary was engaged to Nathaniel Drosselmeyer, on condition that the marriage should not take place for a year. At the expiration of the year, the bridegroom came to fetch the bride in a little carriage of mother of pearl encrusted with gold and silver, and drawn by ponies of the size of sheep, but which were of countless worth, because there were none like them in the world. The young king took his bride to the palace of Sweetcake, where they were married by the chaplain. 22,000 little people, all covered with pearls, diamonds, and brilliant stones, danced at the bridal. Even at the present day, Mary is still queen of that beautiful country, where may be seen brilliant forests of Christmas, rivers of orangeade, sweet milk and essence of roses, transparent palaces of sugar whiter than snow and cleaner than ice. In a word, all kinds of wonderful and extraordinary things may there be seen by those who have eyes sharp enough to discover them.